There he is. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thanks.
Chair Owen, it looks like it is 1:30. I do not see Commissioner Downey in attendance yet, but we do have a quorum if you would like to go ahead and start the meeting.
Okay, will you be tracking to see if Commissioner Downey joins?
Yes, we will.
Okay, thank you. So with having the quorum, I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. As housekeeping is to remind commissioners to keep their audio on mute unless they are speaking. Commissioners other than the chair can mute themselves. Staff will remain muted until needing to speak. As members of the public join the meeting, you will be participating as an attendee. Your microphone and camera will be muted. Only today's panels will be viewed during the meeting. If you're calling in from a telephone and choose to speak during the public comments portion of today's agenda for privacy concerns, the host will be renaming your viewable phone number to resident and the last 4 digits of your phone number. As a reminder, the City of Santa Rosa is committed to creating a safe and inclusive environment free from disruption. We will not tolerate any hateful speech or actions and are well staffed to monitor that everyone is participating respectfully, or they will be removed. If necessary, we'll also immediately end the meeting. Clerk, can you please explain how the public comments will be heard at today's meeting?
At the end, at each agenda item, the item is presented. The chair will ask for Housing Authority member comments and then open it up for public comment. The host in Zoom will be lowering all hands until public comment is open for the agenda item. Once the chair has called for public comment, the chair will announce for the public to raise their hand if they wish to speak on the specific agenda item. If you are calling in to listen to the meeting audibly, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. The host will then call on the public who have raised their hands. Public comment will be limited to 3 minutes and a timer will appear on the screen for the commission and public to see. Once all live public comments have been heard, the meeting host will read email public comment. If you provide a live public comment on an agenda item, but also submitted an email, your email public comment will not be read during the meeting. Additionally, there's one public comment period on today's agenda item to speak on non-agenda matters. Item 5. This is the time when any person may address the Housing Authority on matters not listed on this agenda, but which are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Housing Authority.
Thank you. Can I please ask the clerk for a roll call?
Okay. Commissioner Burke.
Here.
Commissioner Test. Vice Chair Test, excuse me.
Here.
Chair Owen.
Here.
Commissioner Downey. And Commissioner Burke. Call back. Commissioner Olson, excuse me.
Here.
All right, Let the record reflect that all commissioners are present with the exception of Commissioner Downey.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to move ahead and call item 3 and ask any commissioners for statements of abstention on any items today. Hearing none, I'll call item 4.1 and Megan, you can introduce the staff presenter on this item. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Item 4.1 is review of the fiscal year 2021-2022 administrative budget, including overhead. Kate Goldfine, Administrative Services Officer, and J. Brad Wilkes from MGT Consultant Group will be presenting.
Sorry, Megan, hang on one moment. We're promoting them right now.
I have promoted Kate to panelist, and I have
Hello,
given
Brad Wilkes here.
our consultant, Brad Wilkes, permission to speak. Kate, you're muted.
There we go. Now, can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, thanks. Hello, Chair and Authority Commissioner. I'm Kate Goldfine, the Administrative Services Officer for the Housing and Community Services Department. Per your request at the last Housing Authority meeting, I'm here with the city's overhead consultant, Brad Wilkes, with the MGT Consulting Group. So I'll review the department charges, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Wilkes to discuss overhead and IT rates. And can the secretary please start the presentation?
Yes, it'll be up momentarily.
Thank you.
Kate, can you hear me? This is Brad Wilkes.
Yeah, hey Brad, we
I
can
can't
hear
hear Kate.
you.
I could hear Megan, but I can't hear Kate now.
Can you, this is Kate, can you hear me?
Brad, this is Megan, can you hear me? Brad, are you still there?
Well, the first 3 slides are mine, so we may be able to go through those.
Kate, I can hear you.
Ah, fantastic.
All
Okay,
right.
thank you. All
Sorry
right,
about that.
no problem. Next slide, please. All right, this slide represents administrative costs for the entire Housing and Community Services Department. They're budgeted in Fund 2120. Costs are expected to be around $1.4 million in fiscal year 21-22. And all of the programs that utilize these resources pay for a portion of the cost based on their percentage of salaries. The Housing Trust and Housing Choice Voucher programs are budgeting to pay 96% of these costs. Their portion equals housing staff salaries as a percent of total salaries of staff who utilize these services and supplies. And the Homeless Services program has been moved out of Housing and Community Services this year into the City Manager's Office. Code enforcement and the Neighborhood Revitalization Program have also been moved out of HCS into the Planning and Economic Development Department. So the majority of the department at this point is housing, is voucher program and housing trust. So of this budget, 95% is uncontrollable costs, meaning that the department is informed of their share of these costs as a part of the larger city organization. They include the largest overhead at 68% of the budget, which Mr. Wilkes will discuss in detail shortly. Information technology is 17% of the budget. Mr. Wilkes will discuss that as well. We pay approximately $44,000 for the department's share of city liability insurance. Salaries and benefits for admin staff who support the authority are about $100,000. City employees are unionized, and our salaries and benefits are negotiated with city management. Once those are agreed upon, we're required to pay at that amount. The controllable costs represent about $27,000, 2% of the admin budget. They include things such as professional organization memberships and dues, meeting costs, conferences and training, and subscriptions for the director and administrative staff, and things like general office supplies that are used by the whole department, such as paper, pens, paper clips, staples, staplers, that kind of thing. And then shared services are about 3% of the budget at $45,000, and they include things such as the Housing Authority's share of the annual audit costs. The Housing Authority must have its own annual audit. It includes copier costs, which are shared by the department, vehicle expenses such as maintenance, gas, replacement for the department car, admin staff telephone and iPad costs, and shredding services for disposal of confidential documents. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide represents the Housing Choice Voucher Program admin at about $2.5 million. It is 100% funded by HUD, and as such, it must be used to support the Housing Choice Voucher Program. We are not allowed to use this funding for any other purpose. The largest source of funds we receive is the per unit admin fee, also called an admin allowance. We use those interchangeably, that we receive for Santa Rosa clients. We have about 1,900 of those right now. We also receive a reduced portion of the admin fee from other jurisdictions whose clients port into Santa Rosa. We have approximately 250 of those monthly, give or take. And finally, we receive a small grant to administer the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. So we take those funding sources and we need to cover costs for salaries and benefits, which, as I noted, are determined by the city's agreement with employee unions, allocated costs, which are the share of the Fund 2120 costs that I just discussed that are paid by the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And any admin fee that is left after salaries, benefits, and allocated costs is budgeted for services and supplies. We always want to budget to use the full amount of admin allowance available so that we can use it through the year. Anything we do not use is held by HUD in reserve. And our largest expense from the Housing Choice Voucher Program services and supplies category is the admin fee that we pay to other jurisdictions for our clients that port into their area. That is around 30 clients a month. Other expenses are maintenance, gas, and replacement for the Section 8 vehicles, conferences and training, office supplies specific to the program, dues specific to the program, cell phone and iPad charges for staff, printed materials and forms, and subscriptions. In 2021, admin is projected about 2.5 million. You see that here, and rental assistance is projected at about 32 million. Next slide, please. All right, and here we have the Housing Trust proposed admin for fiscal year 21-22 at about 1.8 million, just under 1.9 million. This is funded by 10 different funds, which are broadly categorized into the 5 sources noted on the slide. So first we start with 3 federal sources. Each federal source allows an annual admin allowance. We get 20% of the annual allotment. We get 20% for CDBG, 10% for home, and 3% for HOPLA. So collectively, those provide about $400,000, which is not enough to run any one of those programs. So we have to supplement with local funding. We are also allowed to use a portion of federal funds for specific projects. This is called project admin. It reduces the amount that we can loan or spend on actual projects, so we don't often use it. The local sources of funding for trust admin are compliance fees, the annual city real property transfer tax transfer, impact fees, and loan repayments. We use those to cover the balance of admin costs. Just as with the voucher program, salaries and benefits are determined by the city agreements with employee unions, and allocated costs are the share of Fund 2120 costs that I discussed a few slides ago. Then annually, Megan and I meet to determine the services and supplies needed by the trust, and we budget accordingly. They include the required printing, noticing, advertising for the mandated public participation processes for federal programs, conferences and training to stay up to date with those programs, outside legal assistance occasionally to review complex technical financial real estate transactions, and currently in agreement with other local jurisdictions for a countywide plan to affirmatively further fair housing, which is required by HUD, and a small amount for office supplies specific to the program. So we cover all those costs, we cover all those requirements, and the remaining budget is used for loans for development, conversion, preservation, subrecipient funding for HOPLA and community development, CDBG public services programs, or tenant-based rental assistance for home. And then if we don't use any of that admin budget in 1 year, it rolls over to the next year and is budgeted for loan product. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, or I can turn it over to Brad Wilkes to discuss overhead and IT rates.
Any questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Olson?
Yes, I was wondering, is the executive director's salary negotiated, or is that set by the union?
That's negotiated.
Yeah, I thought so. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
But I would, just to expand on that, there is a range that is established by the city. So it's not a free-for-all negotiation. There is a range in which it is negotiated.
So there's a cap, and then it has to be basically negotiated for something under that cap? Is that what you're telling me?
There's a floor and a ceiling. So it could range from like 140 to 160.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question. I was curious with staff, how are you being divided between housing and other administrative responsibilities? In other words, is staff covering 4 different agencies, 3 different agencies in addition to housing? And is this appears to be strictly for housing, but by piggybacking off of using multiple programs, is there any way to stretch dollars any further with administrative costs?
Yeah, good question. So we already do that to an extent. So staff, so I can use myself for an example. I charge into the Housing Authority for the budget work that I do for them. And then I also charge into the Planning and Economic Development Department because I do budget work for them. And each program pays their fair share of the time spent in those. And we try to divide it truly based on the time that we are spending on those divisions. So to the extent we can maximize staff across divisions, we do that.
Okay. So for an example, if you have 3 different programs, can you use the 3 different programs to buy, let's say, a case of paper as a bulk item and then divide the case of paper between 3 different programs? Or do you have to buy one specific item for each different service that you provide?
Yeah, great question again. So in general, it's the former, and that's what that first slide, the Fund 2120 slide is. That's the shared administrative cost for items like paper or pens or things that we're all using all the time that would be difficult to charge one-off to each program. Those are charged to the administrative fund and then allocated out through the allocated costs to each of the program areas.
Okay. So if you buy a pen and you're writing something for housing and you're writing something for a different agency, I'm sure you can't parse the ink between the different agencies that you're using the pen to fill out a piece of paper with. I know that sounds silly, but
no, you're right.
But this all has to come out in the audit, where they want to know exactly how every cent is being spent.
Right. And that's one of the costs that we pay for out of that Fund 2120 is the annual audit.
Okay. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, thank you.
Commissioner Burr, your question?
Yeah, thanks, Chair On. One is, I know in the past there have been funds available for Housing Authority Commissioner training. And as I recall, the language in this budget is that it's for staff only. it seems to me like it would be a good idea to make sure that there's some funds set aside for training of staff when those opportunities arise over the course of the year. So that's my first question. I have one more.
Sure, I can tell you, yes. In that Fund 2120, there is, and I should have mentioned this, I apologize, there is funding for Housing Authority Commissioners as well.
Thanks, Kate. That answers that. And then I'm assuming that the overhead costs have been adjusted based upon the different responsibilities the department has this year compared to previous years.
I think that is a great segue into Brad's portion of the presentation, where he can answer that and then go in to a little more depth about overhead. So I think we can go to the next slide, and Brad, if you're ready.
Yes, I am ready. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. I remember that we did this a couple years ago. And so this will be a similar process. I have about 10 slides. Just real quickly as an introduction, my name's Brad Wilkes, and I work with the firm MGT Consulting Group. And we are a group of consultants that focus on the indirect costs of city and county governments. And some of our largest and longest term clients are California cities, Santa Rosa being one of them. So next slide, please. We do a couple things for the city of Santa Rosa, and two of them have application to housing. We prepare what's called the citywide cost allocation plan and an information technology cost allocation plan. Plan is an interesting term that comes from the federal government. Most of these documents are documents that look forward, and so it's called a plan. Really, there are a series of formulas and calculations and numbers, hundreds of pages of each, that work together to spread the indirect costs or support costs of a city to departments that benefit from those services. So we do two separate documents for the city, and we're going to spend a few minutes today and talk about them. I'm happy to slow down or speed up. I don't want to take your whole afternoon on this scintillating topic, but I do want to at least provide some overview so you feel comfortable that the process we use in Santa Rosa is a well thought out and detailed process. One thing that I'd like you to keep in mind is the work that I do is an art. It's not a science. This isn't CPA accounting where we find every penny. In fact, if you look at our document, there's nothing to the right of a decimal. That would imply an accuracy that is just not possible in our line of work. So our presentation today is, what is a cost allocation plan? Why do cities do them? Is it a common approach, or is this something unique to Santa Rosa? And then just a brief overview or introduction to both of the documents. Next slide. Okay, why do cities and counties prepare cost allocation plans? There's a variety of reasons, and I've listed about a half a dozen here. These documents help a city and a county identify potential reimbursements from federal programs. In other words, a lot of what Kate just described, overhead, administrative costs, those have to be documented in a certain way or a certain structure. And if the city or the county proceeds with that structure, the federal government will reimburse those indirect costs. So recover costs from federal programs, recover costs from internal service funds. So for example, the cost allocation plan will allocate to the internal service funds within a city. So if the city has a fleet department, the cost allocation plan allocates to the fleet department. So the fleet department will have a true identification of their full costs, their direct costs and their indirect costs. Then the fleet department will use that number to strike their fleet rates, and they're able to recover their full cost from their fleet customers. Part of that full cost will go back to the general fund for the support costs that fleet required to operate. Similar, the cost allocation plan identifies the allocations to enterprise funds. So again, the general fund provides General fund support to enterprise funds. The enterprise funds have rates. Those rates recover both the direct costs of the enterprise fund and those citywide indirect costs. Once the enterprise fund receives the rate revenue, they then send part of that revenue to the general fund, if you will, as a reimbursement for the support they received. Similar to user fees, if the city has a planning department or a building department and they provide services to the citizens of the city, those services are costed at full cost, which includes an allocation from the citywide cost allocation plan. So when permit fees are charged, they can be charged at a full cost if that's what the city council chooses to do. But the cost allocation plan will help the city identify the ceiling they can charge. And that's another purpose of the cost plan. The city also may provide certain services that the state mandates. Some of these services are reimbursable by the state, and the full cost can be recovered by the state if a cost allocation plan is done. And then finally, it just provides the city an opportunity to understand the full cost of their services. Whether they recover all of those service costs or not, at least they are starting at a point where they know the full cost of service. And this is especially applicable to, let's say, recreation programs. So for example, you may have a youth soccer league, youth flag football, youth basketball. Cost allocation plan helps the city understand the full cost of those youth sports. Now, this cost allocation plan and the analysis of the full cost of those sports may be too high to actually charge, but the city at least understands what the full cost is. So these are a few reasons why a city does a cost plan. And in Santa Rosa, as I look over this, I can see Santa Rosa using the cost plan in all 6 of those areas. Next slide. Just to give you a sense for, I guess, a comfort level in having a sense that you're not the only city that does this. I've been doing this work about 30 years, and I've probably worked for 29 of the 30 largest cities in California, and then, of course, many, many small, medium-sized cities. The cost allocation plan process is a process that's adopted throughout the state of California. Here's just a quick slide of some of the cities in a similar population size as Santa Rosa. This slide, the population might be a little bit low because I used this slide a couple years ago, but it will give you a sense that most of the cities your size, we have provided this same service to. And then to the right, similarly to some of your neighbors in the Sonoma County area, we provide this same service to. And another interesting note, all 58 counties in the state of California prepare cost allocation plans, county-wide cost allocation plans, for the same 6 reasons as the previous slide indicated. So this should just give you a sense that this isn't something unique to Santa Rosa, that you're following the same process that other cities and counties follow within the state. Next slide. This is just a quick illustration to help you, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is an illustration of what the cost plan does. The boxes on top just kind of identify some of the general administrative services or departments within the city. Accounting, payroll, accounts receivable, facilities management, city manager, city council, the legal department, building maintenance, purchasing, warehouse, can go on and on and on. The goal of the cost plan is to take these costs and allocate them down to the departments in the city that benefit from those services. So we allocate down to police, to park and rec, to housing, to enterprise funds, to library, to public works, to water, to sewer, and so forth. So the cost allocation plan is a series of formulas, assumptions, statistics that allow us to spread these costs as accurately as we can to those who benefit. Next slide. I wanted to give you a sense for I started this conversation by saying what I do is an art, not a science. And I wanted to show two polar extremes of how you might do a cost allocation plan. It is possible, and sometimes I'll joke with my clients that I can do your cost plan on one piece of paper. This would be a very simple cost allocation plan, one I wouldn't recommend, but I've seen done, and there is some validity to this idea. A simple cost allocation plan would simply be lining up all of the departments in a city. And I've kind of done that in our example on the right. Then I would take the administrative departments, which in this particular case are the 23,500,000. That would form a numerator. So the costs of all of those administrative departments become the numerator of a simple formula. Then the denominator would be the total costs of all of the direct departments. So our formula would be 23,500,000 divided by about 180 million. That produces an indirect cost rate of 13%. It's possible for the city then to take that 13% and charge, if you will, or allocate to each department 13% based on their total expenses. So public safety would get 13% of their total expenses would be added on as administrative costs. Public works, 13%. Transportation, 13%. So forth and so on. This is a simple cost allocation plan. The administrative costs divided by the direct costs. I wouldn't recommend this, but this gives you a feel for the idea of spreading administrative costs. In this particular case, there's nothing unique. There's no unique allocation base. There's no base that is related to the service that is provided. It's just simply how big is your budget. Next slide. This then would be a detailed cost allocation plan. And I just extracted a few pieces of the Santa Rosa plan just to give you a feel for the detail in your plan versus what I called the simple plan. In this particular case, rather than one department called administrative, and that is the numerator, we have 16 departments. So we look at each administrative department on its own. So we have a accounting department, we have a finance administrative department, we have a city manager department, we have HR departments, so forth and so on. That's important because we want to segregate the costs into like services. Because once we have the costs segregated into like services, we can work to find an allocation base that is reflective of that service. So of those 16 departments, we then take those departments and we break them into functions or cost pools. So if we have an accounting department, we could spread all the accounting costs based on a ratio of total expenses. That would be acceptable. We try to do a little bit better though in Santa Rosa. We'll take accounting and we'll break accounting into smaller pieces. Perhaps we'll have a cost bucket called payroll, one called accounts receivable, one called accounts payable, one perhaps called fixed assets. So we'll take the department called accounting and we'll put it into smaller cost pools. The reason we want to do that is if we have payroll, we would rather allocate payroll using a ratio of the number of paychecks issued per department. If we have a fixed asset cost pool, we want to spread that with some allocation base related to fixed assets. So you can see this effort produces a much more accurate document. Rather than taking accounting in a simple approach, the whole accounting department spread over a ratio of expenses, which means payroll is being spread by expenses, which means fixed asset is being spread by expenses. We prefer to do a little more work than that, break them into the cost pools, identify a unique allocation base that's related, and spread it that way. So you can see on the right, there are, here's some examples of what I just described. So central stores, which is mainly a cost center for postage costs. Well, we don't want to spread that related to the total expenses of every department in the city, especially if we have the allocation or we have the history of postage costs by department that use that cost center. Similar to purchasing. We don't want to allocate the cost of the purchasing effort in the city based on expenses, because there may be a city that never purchased anything. I mean, there may be a department that never purchased anything. We would rather use something related to number of purchase orders. Now, this is not a perfect system, because you could say even in purchasing, well, not every purchase order is the same as every other purchase order. That's where this becomes an art, not a science. At least we didn't allocate purchase based on an expenditure ratio or an FTE ratio. We were at least able to get it to something similar to purchasing, which is purchase orders. A great one, which I really like, is in payroll. I alluded to it a little bit earlier. We could allocate payroll based on the ratio of salaries per department in the city. But as you might think about that, a large salary, a particular position in the city, let's say the police chief, receives a paycheck. There may be many, many clerks within the police department that don't even add up to the salary of a police chief. So if you're a payroll clerk, it really doesn't matter the size of the paycheck, it just matters how many paychecks. So rather than using a salary ratio, the city is able to tell us how many paychecks per department. So we use paychecks as our allocation base versus anything else. And this is just a really, really good allocation base. So I wanted to just let you have a sense for the simple effort and a more detailed effort. Next slide. Now, unique to Santa Rosa, these are the particular departments we allocate, and to the right would be, again, some of the examples of allocation bases. And we've kind of reviewed this already. You see we have accounting, which has payroll. We use number of paychecks. We use expenditures. We use count of fixed assets. We use square footages, insurance claims, purchase orders. We use all of these kinds of pieces of data or allocation bases that reflect the service rendered and then provide us with a pretty good allocation of those particular costs. Next slide. Now, we also prepare in the city of Santa Rosa what we call the Information Technology Cost Allocation Plan. This, in effect, is the charging mechanism for the Information Technology Department. The IT department is an internal service fund in the city. What that means, they must recover the costs through their customers for them to exist in the city. There's a whole bunch of different ways to allocate information technology. The way that Santa Rosa does it is a very, very good, detailed, dependable way to allocate information technology. There are some IT departments, particularly in very large cities or state departments, that purchase very expensive software that keep track of CPU minutes, keep track of printer lines printed, keep track of megabytes of storage. This is the A+ method of allocating an information technology department. It's very expensive and it's very time consuming for staff to maintain. But if you're the city of Los Angeles, or if you're the state of Nevada or the state of Oregon, and perhaps the state of California, you invest in this software to spread those IT costs. In the city of Santa Rosa, what the city has chosen to do is to model the citywide cost allocation plan, which is an excellent way to do it. Again, we could do a simple IT plan. We could create a numerator and a denominator, and everybody pays the same percent of their expenditures. Or we could put in a little bit of work. And in Santa Rosa, we create 13 different departments. The document's about 170 pages. It has 70 functions of IT-related costs and services. We put this together, the 13 departments, the 70 functions, and tens and tens and tens of allocation basis, and we produce an IT cost allocation plan that spreads the IT costs to those who use it. Next slide. So here's an example. I just wanted to kind of identify this. You'll see on this particular slide a couple things I wanted to point out. You'll see on there something called fleet management. This is on the blue on the left. The city has, the IT department manages some fleet software. This is software unique to the fleet. Kind of go down a little bit more, you'll see some software called Hansen software. Wanted to point these two out because fleet is very unique and very specific to the fleet department. Hansen is related to development. Perhaps fire might use it, police might use it, planning, building might use it. The reason I point this out is, if we were to do a simple cost allocation plan, the numerator and denominator, housing would get a portion of the fleet management software. Whether you have fleet vehicles or not, you would get a portion of the fleet management software cost. The same with Hansen. Whether you use the Hansen software or not, if we did the simple method, you would be receiving a bit of that Hansen software. I had a great conversation with HUD state officials in Los Angeles in preparing a similar document for the city of Inglewood for their housing department. And I used the example that the way we allocated the costs in this city, we split out IT costs, and one example I used was we identified some library software unique to the library. And then talking about the process to HUD, I use that as an example. In our effort, the housing department in Inglewood will receive no allocation of the library software. HUD really keyed into that and understood what I was talking about. So our effort then takes each of these costs, employee costs, software costs, equipment costs, and we identify either a percentage of use or the number of computers or the expenditure ratio, and we identify who uses what as best we can, and then we spread those costs. So it's similar to the city plan as it is to the IT plan. It could be simple or it could be complex, and there's a variety of shades even in between. Next slide. Now, why would we do this every year? Well, it depends on the receiver of the cost, I suppose. If I was going to pay, if you will, the allocation from the city, I would prefer it to be done more often than less often. Things change. Things change in the city. The number of computers change. Every year we ask the city IT department, tell us how many computers are in the city. And so we've used kind of an example here. One of the large software costs is the Microsoft software. We happen to allocate it using the number of computers per department. Well, a few years ago, that cost was $227,000, and there were 1,318 computers. Housing had 31 of them. Housing's allocated cost was $5,300. Well, a few years later, the cost changed to about $100,000 more, $150,000 more for that Microsoft software, and the number of computers changed. Instead of 2.35% of the total PCs, housing has 2.56. So the allocation of that particular piece of software, that particular example, means that the cost of Microsoft went up. You have fractionally a few more computers in terms of a ratio, and the allocation of Microsoft to housing would go up or down based on that data. So the city and the federal government prefer, in fact, the federal government requires that these kinds of plans to receive federal funding must be done each year. And this is a pretty good example of why you would want to do that. Next slide. Okay, conclusion. The cost allocation plan that we do for Santa Rosa and we do for our other clients and most all cities of any size in California follow, they follow state and federal guidelines. The reason we do that is because it produces a standard. The standard makes us and you feel a little bit more comfortable that you're not out on either polar extreme. Doing this simple cost allocation plan that I've used as our extreme example of something simple would make me and probably should make you feel very uncomfortable. But a detailed effort pushes you toward that zone where you feel more comfortable in its accuracy. Now, is the document perfect? No. But the federal government has said it doesn't have to be perfect. You just have to put in enough effort and work that is equal to the cost that you're going to put in and make sure that that's reasonable. And that's what we've done in Santa Rosa. The costs are calculated each year, so you only pay the actual expenditures of that particular year. We go to great effort to create cost pools and match those cost pools with related allocation bases. We update those allocation bases each year. Where a staff member is going to allocate their time, we ask them to keep as best as they can records about what % of time they spend with which department, and we use that as well. And we even analyze supplies and services to make sure those supplies and services are also allocated in a way that's reflective of where they're used. So I appreciate your bearing with me. This is a topic I obviously love and have spent a lot of years of my life doing. I do also recognize that anything related to accounting may cause some people to their eyes glaze over and perhaps they're not as enthusiastic about it as I am. So I appreciate your attention, and with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Stan. Any of the commissioners have any questions?
I do.
Commissioner Downey?
Brad, I'm aware that all cities have different needs. I'm also aware that Santa Rosa has been hit by a natural disaster. It seems like every year since 2017. So with that said, in developing a cost allocation plan or a budget, is there a way to build in maximum flexibility given the expensive catastrophes that we've had to incur, so that going forward we're better prepared financially? God forbid if something should happen next year.
Okay, okay, let me think about that. I have two thoughts, and let's see if they're related to if these will help with your question. When I go through the allocation plan process and I get the expenditure report from the city does a good job in identifying things that are called disaster-related costs. I'll double check, but if my memory serves me correctly, we've segregated those unique costs that are related to the disaster, and we have not allocated them. So let's say that the city manager has spent an inordinate amount of time related to disasters within the city. They can segregate that in their expenditures. We will exclude that from allocation. So the water department, in their allocation, they won't have to pay those unique disaster-related costs. The fleet department, they're segregated before allocation. Housing, and so forth. If my memory serves me correctly, that's what we've done in the city of Santa Rosa. We've excluded those costs from allocation, trying to make the cost plan not have gigantic spikes and gigantic valleys with unique things that just don't happen every year. Does that help answer the question?
It does, but it seems like we've consistently had something happen every year for the past 3 years, which makes me a little nervous going forward as far as being ready.
Yeah, so I think the way I would circle back around and maybe paraphrase what I was trying to say is where the city can segregate costs that are unique to an unusual effort, we typically will not allocate them. So your cost plan should not have these spikes. Housing should not have to pay a unique cost in accounting or the city manager's office that's related to disaster for the citizens in the neighborhoods of Santa Rosa. So the reason I'm not going to say, you know, I'm 100% perfect in my explanation is I can't remember for sure, but if my memory serves me correctly, that's what we've done in Santa Rosa. We've excluded those costs. You should not receive those costs if the city segregated them and I saw them.
Okay, thank you.
Brad, that's true. We do have special time codes and charge fees where we charge disaster-related costs for two reasons. One, to keep them out of cost allocation plans such as this, and then also to be able to receive federal or state reimbursement for them. We do try to segregate those costs from our normal day-to-day operational costs.
Yes, okay, so Kate made a good point. The cost allocation plan, another purpose for the plan is there's no double dipping. In other words, if the city recovers costs from the enterprise funds, they can't then turn around and kind of ignore that they just received that reimbursement and then allocate those costs again to some other department. So yes, Kate phrased that correctly.
Any other questions from commissioners?
One, if I may, and it has to do with the, you mentioned HUD's kind of discussion you had with HUD in a different jurisdiction. So to what degree does HUD audit the cost allocation plans or any other organization? Is there an auditing process, I guess is the question.
Yeah, well, good question. Let me answer it this way. When I started in this business 25, 30 years ago, the audits were much more common than they are now. There were certain rules that dictated that the cost allocation plans must be sent to a particular federal or state office for receiving. About 15 years ago, the federal government and state government changed that to where they said, you keep your document on file, and if we need it, then we'll know where to look for it, and you can give it to us, and we can walk through an audit. I am not familiar in the last few years really participating in a full audit of a cost allocation plan. The example I used was to solve a particular problem in the city, and the work solved that problem. And so it was a unique case. It wasn't a case of HUD coming out to audit. It was more of a specific question. So to answer your question, my impression is they don't audit these very often.
Vice Chair Tess, you had a question?
I did. With regard to the detailed cost allocation plan for the overall city, what percentage in 2021 was allocated to our department versus what's now being planned for 21-22?
Okay, I didn't quite hear the first part of your question. Did you have a specific administrative department in mind?
Yes, I was talking about a percentage of the overall city's detailed cost allocation plan.
Overall.
What percentage is allocated to housing?
Yeah, so that number is fairly easy to find. I would have to pull out my document and find it. I don't know.
Percentage, just a percentage would be fine.
Boy, I don't know off the top of my head. Kate, are you?
Yeah, so
Okay.
a percentage is difficult, Vice Chair Test. I know the dollar amounts that specifically went to HCS and the Housing Authority, and I can tell you the year-over-year difference, but I do have at my fingertips the entire amount for the city. So in general, the cost plan for housing was $796,000 last year and is going up to $884,000 this year, an increase of about 87,000.
Good, thank you.
And I will discuss the nuances of that in detail next month when we have our study session, what's driving those increases.
Okay, thank you.
Any other commissioners have a question? I do have a question and some follow-up to Vice Chair's question. So basically, if you looked at your one-page approach to allocation versus the multiple-page approach of allocation, and I think Vice Chair's test question was, if we did the one-page approach, here's the total number, here's what your figure was. How does the allocation of cost doing that one-page approach versus the multiple-page approach differ?
Well, I don't know, because we haven't really done the one-page approach. Could be done, and for curiosity's sake, we could do that. In practicality, it would be difficult for the city to have two different cost plans floating around. Kind of going back to Kate's comment that we can't double dip. So I'll give you an extreme example. When I come into a city, I can't sway the results to try to get as high allocation to the water department as I could, and sway the results to get a really, really small allocation to the library. You go in to prepare the cost allocation plan with blinders on and just say, here it is. Here it is for your department, here's for your department. Everybody was treated equally. So whatever method the city chooses, they would have to choose that one method. Now, for curiosity's sake, I could probably calculate that and let you know.
Any of the commissioners want to have that done? Okay, not hearing that. That's something we don't have to have done, but thank you for your answer.
Yeah, you bet. It was a good question.
There any other questions for Mr. Wilkes? Kate, did you have an addition for this item?
No, we can conclude this item if there are no further questions.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do for clarity's sake is that if we're looking at this and it's stating how the item is review the administrative budget, including overhead. So we're only talking about the administrative budget of the overall housing and community services. So we're not talking about the cost of the plan, correct? The vouchers, on program expenses. We're only talking an administrative cost for the programs.
So the first few slides I went through, the first slide was the administrative cost for the entire department. And then the next two were how those broke down for the voucher program and the housing trust.
I understand, but what we're not discussing here, and just to be clear, is that we're not discussing the expense that goes out for the vouchers, for example.
Oh, like the actual rental assistance?
Correct.
Yes, no, correct. My understanding from what you had asked for last month was a review of overhead and admin. And then next month, we'll do the larger study session where we review every expense, including HAP and loans and TBRA and all that. Perfect.
Because so when we come back next month, we've done the deep dive on the administrative costs and how those are allocated, and appreciate the presentation, because it's not always clear as to how allocations are done, and it's a complicated process. The next piece was, what are the overall expenses, not only admin costs, but program costs, and match that up with the revenue associated with that, and would like to see how that compares with the prior years. I want to focus in on something, Megan, that you discussed, which is what the Housing Authority is and is not doing this year as compared to prior years, primarily homeless services. Can you go into that a little bit further to discuss what's being, or Megan, I think, Kate, you discussed this, what's being done and taken under the city managers, and what's no longer under purview of your department?
And Chair Owen, I think this may be a better conversation to have next month when we're looking at the budget as a whole. And then Kate and I have time to provide the appropriate information for you, so you can look at the current fiscal year and see how it compares to fiscal year 21-22.
From a details standpoint, I completely agree, but just from an overall process, what's not in the management, not on a number standpoint, but just what is not being done by the department this time versus last year? What is being transferred? What services? Can you reiterate again what services are being transferred? And Kate, you're nodding your head, so I think you have that answer.
Yeah, and this is just because there is so much work budgetarily because of this. So code enforcement and the neighborhood revitalization program are no longer in the department, and neither is homeless services. Those have been moved out of the department. So we are primarily a housing authority department at this time, with a few other very small program areas still being managed by the department.
And how long were those services done within the department? Has that been going on for a long time?
Code enforcement moved in 2015 and moved out in 2020. Homeless Services has been in the department since the inception of that program, but has grown huge, gosh, I'm thinking its budget, 5 years ago was probably around 800,000. Now it's 3.5 million. So that's moved out of the city. That's moved to the city manager's office and out of housing right now.
Okay, thank you. That was my question. I wasn't looking for detail, but just 30,000 foot level as to what was going on. Thank you. So I'd like to move on to public comment on item 4.1.
We are now taking public comments on item 4.1, review of fiscal year 2021-22 administrative budget, including overhead. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. A countdown timer will appear for the convenience of the speaker and viewers. The first speaker will be acknowledged and invited to speak. Please make sure to unmute yourself when you are invited to do so. Your microphone will be muted at the end of that countdown or the conclusion of your comment. Chair Owen, at this time, I do not see any hands raised, and we have not received any email public comment.
Thank you. I'd like to go ahead and move on to item 4.2. Megan, if you want to introduce the staff presenter, please.
Yes, item 4.2 is the Home Investment Partnerships Program, Tenant-Based Rental Assistance Overview. I will be presenting this item along with Rebecca Lane, Housing and Community Services Manager. And Zoom host, if you could promote Rebecca as a panelist and bring up the presentation, please.
bear with us one moment while we bring the presentation up.
All right, next slide, please.
Sorry, Megan, bear with me here a moment. This is the correct one, right, Megan? Oh, sorry.
Correct. I have it up on two screens. All right, so we're going to start with an overview of the home funding. So on an annual basis, the City of Santa Rosa, which is then delegated to the Housing Authority for administration, receives approximately $750,000 in Home Investment Partnership Act funding, known as HOME. The HOME funding identifies certain percentages, which Kate touched on, that can be used for administration, that's 10%, and community housing development organizations, and that generally is 15%. When you take out those two allocations, we're left with about $560,000, which we have traditionally put towards affordable housing production. HOME in recent years has changed the regulations and has required the funds to be used as the last in for development projects, which has provided some limitations in applying these to affordable housing projects through our solicitation process. Next slide, please. The HOME regulations do allow the funds to be used as tenant-based rental assistance, which is often known as TBRA. This can provide direct rental assistance to households for up to 24 months. And we can assist households up to 60% of area median income versus the 30% that the Housing Choice Voucher or Section 8 program targets. Rebecca Lane and I have done some preliminary math and determined that we can likely assist 33 households a year based on our current rent contributions to eligible households. Next slide, please. And Rebecca will touch on the administration of the program.
Thank you, Megan, and good afternoon, commissioners. This is Rebecca Lane. I'm the manager of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and we have in this department, since the pandemic began, we started with an emergency TBRA program, which has provided us some insight as to the program overall. So if we do that, that's a different set of rules that came along with the emergency TBRA program. So I'll just be focusing on going forward if you decide, commissioners, to adopt an ongoing TBRA program, what that might look like. So the Department of Housing and Community Services will administer the program. As mentioned in the previous slide, it's similar in concept to the Housing Choice Voucher Program insofar as the rental calculation is what we can do as a jurisdiction is that we can adopt the existing rental calculation that is used for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And that is what we've done for the emergency TBRA program, and that has allowed us to utilize the existing infrastructure of the Housing Choice Voucher Program software, as well as the staff training and other infrastructure and needs for getting the rental assistance out the door. It is paid similarly to the voucher program. It's paid directly to the owner. So again, we're utilizing and would be utilizing going forward the existing processes that we have to make payments directly to owners on the program through our accounts payable department. So the TBRA program is different in many ways too from the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So one of them is that it is time limited. It provides up to 2 years of assistance, and the participating jurisdiction, which would be the department, is required to examine the income of the family at least annually. In the TBRA program, that we can also establish a preference for people who have been experiencing homelessness, people who are elderly, or people with disabilities. And this is a written policy that would need to be adopted if we were going forward with setting preferences for the TBRA program, but it is just an option. It is not a requirement. HUD does require that the participating jurisdiction oversee the day-to-day operations of the program, and that's whether we're administering it internally or whether it's being contracted out. So that is a requirement of the program as well. Megan mentioned that we are able to assist approximately 33 households per year. That's what we are projecting based on the information that we have on our current housing choice voucher per unit costs. And next slide, please. So the purpose of the study session today is just to present this information regarding the home TBRA program as an option, and to have the commissioners present us with any input and direction going forward.
We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Commissioners have any questions?
Rebecca, is this just another way of helping people get into housing, or is it taking place a part of the existing?
It would be another resource that we could offer to families in Santa Rosa. They would need to be at or below 90% of the participants would need to be at or below 60% of the area median income. We would have the option to offer assistance of the remaining 10% to go up to income levels as high as 80%. So that's very different than the Housing Choice Voucher program. And that would be therefore an offer to a different population than is currently being served by the voucher program, which, as Megan mentioned, is the requirement there is that 75% of the assistance is targeted to households at or below 30% of AMI. And we can go as high in the voucher program to 50% of AMI. So this income targeting is different.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Downey?
Yes, I think I was reading in the Press Democrat that there is some funding that's going to be sent to local jurisdictions, specifically Santa Rosa, to help with tenants who've not been able to pay their rent because of COVID, and landlords who have not been able to receive rent because their tenants have been furloughed. Can you verify, is there any federal funds coming to help with that particular shortage?
Yes, so this is Megan. I'm happy to answer that. And certainly if there's additional questions, I can come back in April with more information. It's actually coming to the County of Sonoma. So the U.S. Treasury and then the Department of Housing and Urban Development have allocated 2 tranches of funds to jurisdictions with a population over 200,000. So the City of Santa Rosa was not eligible because our population is under 200,000, but the County of Sonoma will be receiving approximately 15 million, directly from the Treasury, and then through funds that will be flowing to the state and then back to the county, another 15 million. So a total of $31 million will be coming to the County of Sonoma to be administered countywide to assist with rental payments, and they can be either to tenants or to landlords, and also can be applied to utilities that are in arrears for people who have been impacted by COVID. We are still receiving additional information on the implementation of this program, so I don't have details on how it's going to be administered and outreach that'll be available to the public, but I can certainly come back in April with those facts once they are further developed. And then also, just for your information, the city attorney and I will be conducting a study session for the city council in April on rental assistance, and then also the county's recent eviction ordinance.
Thank you, Megan.
Any other questions?
Yes, Chairman, I have a question. Can either Kate or Megan explain how similar this program proposal is to what the county is doing with the use of home funds?
And Rebecca certainly can chime in as well, because she does have a relationship with the county's housing authority, but the county does use their home funds to provide tenant-based rental assistance. And so we have been in conversation with their Housing Choice Voucher staff on how they administer the program. Rebecca?
Yes, the Sonoma County Housing Authority also has a home allocation, and as Megan said, they do use that for tenant-based rental assistance, or TBRA. So those are, I don't know in terms of how many families per year, but it is a much smaller program than the voucher program, similar as we would have established if that's what we're going to do going forward. So we're estimating we'd be able to help about 33 families per month per year with this.
Thanks, Kate. I was just, I'm thinking, if it makes sense to the city, the more similar the program in the county is to the city of Santa Rosa's program, the easier it is for those recipients that might be pursuing use of the programs. So that's my
Right. So this would also be limited to the jurisdiction. So County of Sonoma residents would have access to the existing Sonoma County Housing Authority TBRA program, and if we establish one going forward, it would be available only to the city of Santa Rosa residents.
Any other questions? So I have a few. Megan or Rebecca, the home funds that were used in the past, what was the last use of home funds in the prior fiscal year or year prior? Not specifically, just in general. These funds have to go in last on a project, is that correct?
That is correct. And so we've had some difficulty finding projects where, given the small amount of resource that's available, that we have a project that'll have a gap that's about, less than 600,000. So as Rebecca mentioned, we did a reprogramming with home funds that we had available at the end of last fiscal year and provided the emergency rental assistance for COVID. And we were able to launch that in June. And off the top of my head, I unfortunately cannot recall the last project where we provided construction assistance through home. It may have been the Crossroads, but I can't confirm that right now.
So it's been a little while?
Correct.
So, and as we go through the numbers and look at costs coming in with NOFA requests, either the CDBGR or knowledge of other projects coming in, per unit costs are anywhere from $400,000 to $600,000 a unit. So $560,000 doesn't even really get one unit built. So keeping it in the current home, the way the home funds are being used toward building projects is very difficult, versus this can be adding up to 33 vouchers coming in for people to come in. And Rebecca, I have a question. If the current housing choice voucher is 33%, 30% of the area of median income, and someone is doing better, but not quite great yet, meaning that if their income goes up and they no longer qualify, I know there's a process to go through, not losing your voucher right away, but would that type of resident be able to then use this type of voucher for 2 years and then free up a housing choice voucher for somebody using that would qualify at 30%? Is that a possibility for this?
Well, I can look into whether or not that would, how that could be an allowable preference. I'm not sure if that would be an allowable preference for TBRA, but I can certainly look that up and find out and get back to you. in terms of how it works with the Housing Choice Voucher program is the income limits don't apply as soon as a person leases with a voucher. So what that means is you have to be at or below either 30% or 50% of AMI. And again, it's the majority of our assistance is targeted to households at or below 30%. So once you're established on the program, then you are considered over income, not once your household income reaches a different threshold on the income level, but when 30% of your monthly adjusted income is equivalent to the entire rent and your utilities. So basically, when you can afford to pay your entire rent, that's when you graduate off the program. And there is a 180-day window, a cushion that someone that is automatically built in, so that if an income change or income loss happens during that 180-day window, the family can come back and request to be reinstated on the program.
And if that doesn't work, they could qualify under this program because it's at a higher income approach, income level?
It's possible. So, right. Okay. So we would, I'll be doing so. I'll look into the waiting list and the tenant preference policies and whether or not we could set that as a preference, or if we could just refer people to that resource if they felt that they needed, ongoing assistance. They would be, though, paying their entire rent at that point. So okay. in the unit that they currently occupy. Okay. So they may not need the assistance at that point.
Thank you for the clarification, because it's always, I've never quite really fully understood, well, what if you actually get that pay raise you've been hoping for? Now you lose your voucher, and the answer is no, you don't. You just pay more of your rent toward that voucher program until you're paying the full. Right.
Exactly, so, until you're paying the full rent and your utilities, because utilities are calculated into that as well, your out-of-pocket utility costs. So it's when you can cover your housing costs with 30% of your monthly adjusted income that you are weaned off the program. You do have that 180-day cushion for a readjustment.
So this would help on the demand side, providing up to approximately 33 more voucher residents. How are we doing on the supply side with apartment units available for these types of, that would have the market rate, considered market rate rents available versus luxury apartments or something that would not qualify because the rents are too high for that type of unit?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. The TBRA program does follow the same rent reasonableness rules as the Housing Choice Voucher program. So we would be advising families utilizing this resource to essentially look, kind of the middle of the market, not, as you say, luxury housing necessarily, but the vacancy rate, if you're asking about that as well, we have seen a little bit of a softening in the rental market. Not anything spectacular. It's still difficult out there, but it is improving over the last few years in terms of our participants being able to find housing.
And then if anybody can answer this, maybe Jeff Burke, if you might know. There was discussion about having, you cannot discriminate based upon somebody wanting to, Rebecca's shaking her head, I think she knows what I'm asking. You can't discriminate if somebody coming in from a voucher, you can't turn away somebody because their rent's gonna be, that is in play right now, is that correct?
That's correct. That is a statewide ordinance, and then we also have established a city ordinance to that effect, and that's a source of income discrimination ordinance, which means that a landlord has to consider a voucher holder. They can't make a blanket statement that they will not rent to tenants utilizing a housing choice voucher.
Okay.
Rebecca, is there any teeth in that law? In other words, it's pretty easy for one to say that they're not going to give somebody an apartment for some reason, when the true reason is that they don't want to take a voucher recipient, is there any teeth to fine them or whatever if they're found to be not complying with the law?
Well, it's and Jeff Burke might remember the local enforcement policy, but we do refer if tenants. We know that property owners and managers have established policies in compliance with the state in terms of their tenant screening. So how they need to adjust their tenant screening procedures. So there's new requirements about that owners are adopting. And if we receive any concerns from our participants about whether or not they feel that this has not been followed, then we refer them to our legal resources, including Fair Housing, Sonoma County Legal Aid, California Rural Legal Assistance, and others.
It's not up to you.
No, we're not the enforcement agency.
Okay, thank you.
Rebecca, I got a question for you. And this is a carryover from a conversation we had with one of the other city attorneys, is how to prove that you're being discriminated against. Because a lot of people aren't going to come out and write you a letter saying, you know, we don't take Section 8 housing. But at the same time, too, how do you protect tenants who are subtly being not taken seriously because they have a Section 8 voucher? And I think Sue Gallagher? I think her response was, it's very difficult. It can be very difficult to prove. And I had proposed if there was a way to educate potential landlords, you know, about this program and some of the quote unquote stigmas associated in the past with this program, that it's guaranteed, well, not guaranteed, but it's guaranteed rent in a sense, if that's an appropriate word in this context.
If I may just step in through the chair. So I think you're raising good questions, but I want to be mindful that we're kind of moving away from the topic on the agenda. I will share briefly that what I do recall, and this is going back over a year, so my memory is a little fuzzy, but Commissioner Downey, I think you're right. I think one of the concerns that was raised was the ability to prove up your case, and that's true with any form of discrimination. So yeah, sometimes it may be difficult, but you know, there's different ways that that you could try to prove up that discrimination. And if this is a topic that the Housing Authority, if the commissioners want, you know, to have a discussion another day on a special agenda item, then you can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff Burke. One of the things I would like to have discussed in the future, just for everybody's understanding, is, and Rebecca, you brought up the term rent reasonableness. So that process and how it works in terms of just as simple, we can put that on the agenda in a future meeting to explain, okay, so here's what the rent is, market rent. This is how the rent reasonableness comes into what's considered rent in the voucher system and how that works. Because it's not, I haven't been doing this that long and it's not quite understood. You know, HUD comes out with figures that this is what the fair market rent is, but that's not necessarily what City of Santa Rosa uses. It's the rent reasonableness. And if we can put that on an agenda in the future to just have a brief presentation of how that works, so you could walk through and say, okay, here's the numbers on the programs for housing choice. It's 30%. So this is a person making a household 1 to 4 would make this income. This is what the rent would be. This is the utilities, and have a discussion as to when that information is released each year.
We can
I
certainly.
think that would be helpful for future discussions. It's
We'll
just
put that on a future agenda.
nothing longer complicated, just an presentation of how the numbers work. Because we talk about these issues all the time, but I'm not sure if there's a complete understanding of how that works.
Okay.
Commissioner Burt?
Yeah, well, my first question, I guess, is related to the presentation where it says home funds for affordable housing production need to be the last funds, the affordable housing production. So I guess my question is, can it be used for rehabilitation of affordable housing?
I would need to review the home regs because I don't know off the top of my head.
Thanks. And then my only reservation about going this direction is that if you do have a very tight market and people are having a very difficult time using their vouchers, for the regular program, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and this adds more people searching for units that are scarce, may not be able to be found, then it would be preferable to use the funds for housing production or rehabilitation. And so I guess that's my only reservation. I don't know. I know that Rebecca has kind of commented on the fact that the market has gotten softer, and it's improving in terms of people's ability to find units. But maybe some more specifics on that when you do return, or now if you have time.
Well, and certainly in our next study session, I think it's 4.3, we're going to be talking about the upcoming NOFA. So we'll have a review of the funding that we'll have for production in the very near future. But Rebecca, if you have any input on the amount of time that it's taking tenants to secure housing presently there.
Yeah, just in general right now, I can comment on, the voucher program and the performance there. Our success rate is pretty high, and the success rate is the number of vouchers that we issue. Of those, how many find housing? And we're hovering at about 80 to high 80% in that arena. So there's not very many people who need to ultimately give their vouchers back to the Housing Authority. We have also, as I said, we've seen definite improvement in terms of the number of units that are advertised through our department. That's sort of an anecdotal sign, but we definitely see more property managers now reaching out to us to say, hey, I have a vacancy and I'd like to participate in your program, and I want to advertise directly to voucher holders. And some data that I don't have off the top of my head, but that we do track and I can bring back is, for example, like how long it takes for a new voucher holder to find housing. Those are some pieces of information that might inform going forward with TBRA, and sort of taking that as a model, as it were, to give us a little bit more information on some of those things. And also considering that the TBRA, the potential TBRA participants would also potentially have a higher income level. And I'm not sure, how that might interplay with some of those data points.
Thank you again.
Any other commissioner questions? So from going forward, what would happen now? Would this be a permanent change? Is this, because this is a study session and there's not a resolution to vote for, what happens now?
Well, if there's direction and support to proceed with implementing TBRA in the upcoming fiscal year, we would incorporate it into the budget and action plan. So we would need to understand that it's supported before we return with the budget at the next meeting. And then certainly if the Housing Authority was inclined in the future to reprogram home funds for production, we could look at pivoting the funding in future fiscal years, and it's a 24-month commitment, so we could scale it back if that was the direction.
So we're not taking a vote. Any commissioners have discussion or recommendations in direction?
Can I ask a quick question? Can somebody quickly explain the difference between TBRA and a project-based voucher?
Yeah, I can take that question. Thank you, Commissioner Downey. So the project-based vouchers are part of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So the funding is, that's part of the voucher program. So this is a different funding source. And this is only tenant-based rental assistance. That's what we're, that's what this resource could be used as. So it would just be direct rental assistance to, on behalf of families to landlords, and would not be tied to a particular project.
Well, I have a question.
Mr. Johnson?
As of right now, what is that median Sonoma County income that they're 30%? Do you know what that number is for a family of four?
Yes. So for a family of four, 30% is 34,100. And just for the point of comparison, 60% is 68,160. This again is for a family of four.
So below that, I'm below that number. The 34,100 is a gross income that they can have, and I'm sorry. Would you rephrase it for me, please?
Yeah. So under the current Housing Choice Voucher Program, your traditional Section 8 program, a household, the majority of the households cannot earn more than 34,100. Again, this is for a family of four.
Yes.
And then under the TBRA program that we're discussing right now, the income limit for a family of four would be 68,160.
That's okay. I got it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And again, these income levels are adjusted annually. So this is the 2020 limits. The 2021 will be released in June.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I just, I do support going forward with this. I am interested in having a response from staff on if it can be used for rehabilitation. Then does that change your opinion about how to use these funds? I mean, if there's some projects out there that are really in dire straits and could use that money for rehabilitating existing units, we always have a hard time finding funds to put into preservation of housing, rehabilitation of housing. So I'm just wanting to make sure that you are comfortable with making the recommendation if these funds can also be used for rehabilitation.
Again, I need to go back to the regs, but I would say the other limitation that I am aware of off the top of my head with the use of these federal funds for rehab would be the borrower would then need to prepare an environmental assessment pursuant to HUD requirements. So that would be an additional step in order to rehabilitate. And I believe that home regulations prevent us from putting additional home funds into a project. So for instance, if we had an older project from the year 2000 that is suddenly in need of rehab and it originally had a home investment, we could not put additional funds into it, home funds. So there are some limitations.
Oh, it's unlikely that it would change your recommendation, but I would like to, have you give some thought to that when you come back. Thank you.
Will do.
Okay, I'd like to, listening, I'm hearing that what we want to do is look into whether or not the funds can be used for rehabilitation of the home funds. And this would come back maybe next month as part of the budget process.
So the budget next month, I believe, is just a study session. We can have a separate, if you would like to take formal action, we can put it on the agenda as a report item. So that
I would want to put it, yeah, our city attorney is shaking his head, yes. It's so we can do this with as formal action I'd like to look at it as a 2-year trial and assessed after that point in time. And that would match up with how long people can stay on it. I don't know if that's possible, because if you put people on after the initial, if that works, but if you could look into that, looking into the possibility as to whether, if we can put it on a temporary basis of a couple of years.
Well, I think one thing we could certainly do is we can look at a 2-year trial, and we can come back after a year and review the implementation and see if that's meeting the
Perfect.
desires of the housing authority and how we are assisting the community.
See if the assumptions actually are playing out to what we thought they would be. Perfect. Are there any other questions from commissioners?
So
Comments?
could we essentially put in the language of a sunset clause if we were to approve this, to give us an opportunity to get out of it if it's not doing what we expected it to do?
The question was, could we put in a sunset clause? Is that what you're asking, Commissioner Downey?
Yes, if it turns out that it's not working, could there be the language of a sunset clause that would enable us to get out of it and try something else if it's not meeting our expectations for this local jurisdiction?
And just for clarifications, Commissioner Downey, what do you consider not meeting expectations?
Not meeting the population that we anticipated it to meet, getting back to not being able to use any funds for rehab, if that becomes blatantly clear, since rehab tends to is becoming more of a common discussion in our meetings, and just any other idiosyncratic needs that we may need to use this funding for. Would we be able to do that, or would the restrictions prohibit us from addressing issues that are coming before this housing authority? Yes, yeah.
Jennifer?
So if I may step in, so it sounds like this is, the staff is getting direction today to bring an item back. And that item, I'm not quite sure the form, but it's not going to be in the form of an ordinance. When you say sunset clause, that's my thinking, is that it's like an ordinance that requires a more formal process. So I think that your board will have more flexibility if upon review after it's a year at whatever stage to make whatever changes. I mean, it sounds like it's more of a budget item or perhaps a resolution. So the ability to make changes will be, you'll have a lot more flexibility, I believe.
So Jeff, would you call it a trial period? Would that be more of an accurate characterization as opposed to a sunset clause?
Yes.
Okay.
Megan, does that provide the direction?
Yes, we will return. I'll return in April with a resolution, and we'll work on addressing the items that have been discussed.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion from commissioners? We'll open it up for public comment on this item.
We are now taking public comments on item 4.2, Home Investment Partnerships Program, Tenant-Based Rental Assist Overview. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. A countdown timer will appear for the convenience of the speaker and viewers. The first speaker will be acknowledged and invited to speak. Please make sure to unmute yourself when you are invited to do so. Your microphone will be muted at the end of the countdown or at the conclusion of your comment. Chair Owen, at this time I see no hands raised and we have not received any email public comments.
Thank you very much. Moving on to item 4.3. And Megan, if you want to go ahead and introduce the staff presenter.
Yes, thank you. Item 4.3 is the fiscal year 2021-2022 notice of funding availability process. I will be presenting this item, and if Nicole Rathbun could also be promoted as a panelist to assist with any questions. And if you could get the presentation up, thank you. All right. Next slide, please. So in fiscal year 21-22, we anticipate having approximately $8 million in federal and local funds available to use for affordable housing production purposes. Similar to what we have done with our last few rounds of notices of funding availability, often known as NOFAs, we like to position projects for upcoming state funding opportunities. And these include the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee applications, which are going to be due in May 2021. The 9% tax credits, and this is the second round of 21. It'll be due July 1st. And then the multifamily housing program, which will be available in summer 2021. And all three of these are important resources in order to fully fund affordable housing projects and advance them towards construction. Next slide, please. So the priorities that we have used over the past few years have been new construction targeted to large families, seniors, workforce, or special needs, which can be veterans, people experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. The priorities that we have, again, applied to projects within the last few funding rounds are the readiness to start construction. We're looking for projects that can start as quickly as possible, projects that are in priority development areas, opportunity areas, station area plans, and then high resource areas, which are areas of Santa Rosa that have a high level of services and they can score better in state funding rounds. We also look for projects that provide deeper affordability. So these would be units, a larger percentage of units that are targeted to households at 30 and 50% of area median income. And if there are significant benefits. So if it is in an area that we have been looking to revitalize, if it's an asset that has been identified by the city as something that we would like to redevelop in the near future, or if there are other attributes associated with a project that we can identify with when we're reviewing the project. Next slide, please. What the other areas we look at are feasibility. So tied back to readiness, can it start construction in the very near future? What are the self-scores that the applicant has provided in the application materials that make it a competitive project? What are the developer's qualifications and capacity? Are they able to carry out this project and do so in a timely fashion and provide us with a high quality product? And then to what extent can they maximize other funding sources? Next slide, please. So in response to our NOFA processes and in an effort to constantly improve the way we administer our NOFA process, we are proposing to incorporate a point system into the fiscal year 21-22 process. And this would provide up to 100 points for projects. And so it would create an immediate metric for reviewing a project when we have the committee take a look at it, and then when we bring it to the Housing Authority. So the points, and the font does get a little small. The first area would be readiness. So again, can the project start construction quickly? Has it received its planning approvals? Are building permits ready to issue? And it would be a range from 0 to 10, 0 being there's no application submitted for planning, 10 being it's fully entitled. Second would be affordability. This being identified as a priority can be awarded up to 20 points. So what percentage of the project is restricted and how many of the units fall within 30, 50, 60, and as we've been seeing lately, 80% of AMI, and having points awarded within the 0 to 20 point scale. Bedroom sizes are also an important factor. Are they all studio units, or do we have a range up to 3 bedroom, which can serve large families? Special needs set-asides. So this would go back to, are there units for veterans? Are they identifying formerly homeless individuals? Or is there another segment of the population that the developer is proposing to set aside units for? And this can tie back to other funding sources too. If you're looking at some of the competitive programs at the state, this may play into that. Leveraging. So to what extent are you seeking other funding sources? Are you looking for tax credits, bonds, applying to HCD's program, or are you pursuing other funding opportunities such as private loans and donations? And then we want to take a look at how competitive the project might be in the state funding rounds, whether that's SIDLAC, TCAC, or MHP. And so this would be based on the applicant's submittal of the application to that various, those bodies. And this is something we have required in prior rounds as well, as provide us with a copy of the application you're submitting so we can see what you're presenting to the state. As I mentioned on a prior slide, the developer and manager experience is very important. So up to 15 points, depending on the experience. Have you developed units locally? How many units have you developed, or are you developing throughout the state? And as we've done before, if you are a new applicant to Santa Rosa, we will reach out to other jurisdictions that you have worked with and obtain references for your performance and management of the development. Services and amenities. So what is the proximity to grocery, libraries, parks, schools? And this also will tie back to the project's competitiveness in other funding rounds. And then finally, other factors. And these would be, has the Housing Authority assisted you in the past? If we're already financially invested in a project, that may be something that we certainly want to see proceed to construction. If you are on a site that has been identified by the city as being an important redevelopment opportunity, that could be another factor that we provide points to. Next slide, please. We also like to continue with having a subcommittee, and the subcommittee has been comprised of 2 Housing Authority commissioners that meet with staff to review the funding recommendations after the applications have been reviewed and provide us with their input and direction on how we will make the recommendation to the Housing Authority, or recommendations. Next slide, please. So staff is seeking direction on the priorities that were presented and the appointment of a subcommittee that will help us with the focus NOFA for 21-22. And then for the Housing Authority's information, as a result of the May 2021 SIDLAC application deadline, we're hoping to release our NOFA next week in order to receive projects and review the applications in advance of that deadline, and hopefully have a special meeting in early May if we have competitive projects that will be proceeding with those funding sources. So that concludes my presentation. Nicole and I would be happy to answer any questions that the Housing Authority may have.
Megan, I think this is fabulous. I think this is great. You should be congratulated. It'll do 3 things. First of all, it will help your staff. Number 2, it will help us. Number 3, it will help the developer. So if he gets a copy of this thing, they can add, they don't. So I think it's great. And it also makes it so much simpler for to sit down. Now, the parameters you develop to who gets how many, in other words, how those points are determined is maybe up for grab. But I think it's a great program.
So in response, thank you, Commissioner Olson. In response to your comments, I'd like to say that Nicole has been instrumental in developing the point system. And what we intend to do is include the point scale in the NOFA so a developer can understand the ranges within those particular areas and can quickly identify where they'll be able to fall. And the intent is to provide more transparency in our review process. And we're constantly trying to improve this. So we'll take a look at it after this next funding round and see how we can revise it further.
Okay, congratulate Nicole for me.
She's right there.
Hi, Commissioner Olson. Thank you for your comments. The intent of the point scale is also to have smaller scales within each category. For example, if there's a category worth 10 points, we would establish ahead of time the criteria for meeting a score between 7 and 10, for example. And then the next tier down, what is the criteria for meeting a score between, say, 4 and 6, and have subcategories within the total amounts of points available. So it's very clear to applicants, to the housing authority staff, the public, and staff as to where these projects are falling and the reasoning for their scoring. So we will have it tied down even tighter than the overall points available as shown in the PowerPoint.
Great, thank you.
Any other comments from commissioners?
I guess the only comment I have, thank you, Nicole. I do appreciate the scoring. It's just looking at the larger picture of being able to build ourselves out of or put a dent in low-income housing, just kind of as a big existential question. And then looking at how much creativity can we employ to use more high-density housing as a way of providing more housing opportunities for people. With, even though I think it was Rebecca that said the rental market is softening, it's still extremely expensive. And I see more people needing some sort of subsidy, which is so eloquently laid out in your point scale. And I'm just curious, looking forward, as you're granting NOFAs, how much of a dent are you projecting us being able to put a dent? How much dent are you projecting us being able to put into our housing need within Santa Rosa? Or Megan?
Megan?
I think, and Nicole, jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, we've been seeing project contributions about $150,000 per unit. And so if we're looking at about $8 million in this upcoming round, that's probably about 53 units that we would be able to assist. But we won't know until we receive the applications and we're seeing where those projects are positioned financially. With the CDBG DR that the Housing Authority acted on in January, we had 38 million available, and I believe we're able to assist over 300 units.
Vice Chair Test, do you have a question?
Yes. Yes, a question for Nicole. Nicole, on the January meeting and the evaluation that you put forward for the NOFA, for the DR funds, did you use a similar point system, and now you've honed it down to what is before us today, or was the reason for putting the point system, which is great, because of any issues that you ran into the DR NOFA?
With the DR NOFA, what our constraints were operating through HCD's required priorities. So many of their required metrics to meet in these applications were a simple yes and no. So a scoring factor on those were not necessary. And there were, I believe, 4 other categories that could have been graded on a point scale. But instead, with the applications that we did receive, it didn't warrant breaking them down to that degree. It was things like, is the project entitled yes or no, or in process? So it didn't necessitate the detailed level of point scoring that we are trying to establish for future funding rounds.
But if I can interject, I'd say that based on some of the feedback we received following the DR NOFA, having an established point system will certainly help us in communicating with the applicants on how and why they were ranked the way they were. And so it'll be an objective criteria that we can apply across all projects and help improve our communications with those developers and let them know.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad to hear that. I did have a comment regarding the subcommittee. I think it was, I was part of the last subcommittee, which included 2 of the city council persons. And I found that really valuable. And I think it's also an opportunity to have the council members get to know more detailed things about how the housing authority operates.
Commissioner Test, are you requesting or suggesting that we include a city council member in the upcoming review?
I think it would be valuable from a point of view of informing the city council as to what we do. I'm not really sure that they know all of the details that we always discuss at our meetings. And all it can do is help elevate the council's opinion of the housing authority and how important some of these things that we take on is valuable for the city overall.
If that is the direction of the housing authority, I'm more than happy to reach out to the mayor and ask for a council member to assist us in the review for these upcoming applications. So I'll wait for further direction on that.
Yeah, now that's my opinion. I'd like to know if there's other commissioners who feel the same way.
To follow on that, for the CDBG-DR funds, that was reviewed by 2 housing authority members as well, two members from the city council, as Vice Chair Test alluded to. And then there was also a last one that was done, and I'm not remembering which one it was. This was the senior center project on Bennett Valley Road. What was the instance for that where we also had 2 members from city council review the projects? Was that a NOFA specific, or I don't remember what that came through?
Sure, so that was because the former Bennett Valley Senior Center site is a city-owned facility. That was a request for proposals to develop the site, so an RFP, which is different than our NOFA process. An RFP is basically saying to the community, to the development community, we have this site that we would like to have developed for this purpose, but there were no funds attached to it. And because it's a city-owned site, that is why there were city council members included in that review.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies the differences. Any other comments?
Yes, if I may.
Commissioner
So if I understand this, since the NOFA is supposed to be released next week, I think is what I heard. This and there won't be time for any kind of. This is kind of a beta test. Do you see that as it being kind of an experimental test for modifying the NOFA?
Yes, we would like to implement this point system, and then probably June. So following review of the applications and action, we'll come back and kind of do a debrief on how we think it went and where we can improve for the next funding cycle and try and get it ahead of this process.
Yeah, that would definitely be helpful, for a committee to kind of get an idea. Also, to what degree, I mean, you don't really know how well a point system is going to work until you kind of had some experience with it. So I would hope that there would be some latitude in the process, but I also wonder if you've had any, there's probably no opportunity to have any reaction from the applicants in the community, because they're probably hearing about this for the first time right now if they're tuned in. Is that correct?
Correct. I think there are some developers that are listening in this afternoon. And in formulating this point system, I did research other jurisdictions, and so there are some don't have point systems like we had previously been operating, and some do have point systems. So it's kind of all over the board, and so it would certainly be great to try it and see how it works. And then we have the other factors category, which gives us a little wiggle room to identify things that are important to us or not so important, and then return in June and do a debrief and get your feedback.
Okay, thanks. So do these tend to align with the other funding sources, for instance, TCAC and any other funding source that applicants are likely to be seeking?
The general criteria does follow the TCAC and SIDLAC, and then also, as I touched on the point scale, there is a section for competitiveness. So if a project is scoring based on what the developer or applicant has provided us, if it's scoring very well, then they have the potential to receive the full 10 points in that particular category. That will, just to note, that will be a disadvantage for projects that aren't going to be seeking bonds or tax credits or other HCD funding sources.
It would be interesting to hear the input on that. On your points system, I think when it got to amenities, you mentioned groceries and some off-site kinds of things. I would really suggest on-site amenities be included in that review. And for an example, you have a family development and you have lots of kids, and what are they doing in terms of recreational opportunities for kids, and where are they located? Kind of that part of it. I'd like to see people put a lot of thought into what they can do to support those folks that are going to be living there that are on very low income and have fewer opportunities. And I think the only other thing is that I don't recall that our other NOFAs, I mean, obviously the CDBG-DR was focused on new production, but have our others excluded applicants for rehabilitation?
We have not excluded, and my intention wasn't to exclude, and certainly if it's the inclination of the Housing Authority, we could set aside 100,000 or so. We do have a fairly robust pot of money for the upcoming fiscal year for rehab, but last year for 2021, it went towards new production, and the prior year, which was 1920, the funds went towards new production, and that was a project that was able to receive a 9% allocation from TCAC. So for the last few years, this has been how the NOFAs have kind of been geared.
So the intent isn't to exclude applications for rehabilitation?
No, and actually now that I'm thinking about it, we did provide a couple small rehab loans, and Nicole, if you remember what year it was, they were for Community Action Partnership. I think altogether they needed about $200,000 in rehab funding, and we were able to carve that out of the NOFA and still make awards for new production.
And I believe those awards were made at the tail end of 2019, with the loan underwriting occurring in the beginning part of 2020.
I guess I'm recalling, I'm not sure when it was, it goes back probably a few years. I know there were two applicants that were seeking funds, one for Apple Valley of Papago for the units there, and the other was North Point Apartments. I think that was Bridge Housing.
That was in 2017, and that was, yes, Apple Papago, and then Chelsea Gardens, and that was specifically for CDBG funds, because CDBG can be used for rehab.
Yeah, North Point was in there, the mix there at one time as well, but yeah. So as long as those applications aren't excluded, because sometimes preservation can be really important if there's no other options for properties that are in need of repair. Hopefully they can find other sources and we'll have more funds for new production, but that's not always the case. Thank you.
Correct, and I think we did see that in February when we had the rehab loan for the Hearn Veterans Village. So we'll make sure to include rehab as an eligible source if that's the wish of the entire.
That's my view, and obviously, and also I think the Vice Chair Test's suggestion that a member of the City Council be invited to participate in the committee I think that's a good idea.
So, Megan, if an application scores low, will they have an opportunity to resubmit it for a higher scoring, or is it just rejected and moved on to the next one?
Depending on the applications we receive, the number of applications, and the funding sources that they are pursuing, I anticipate we would advance the highest scoring once the review committee has taken a look at what staff has initially reviewed and ranked. It really depends on the number of applications and the amount of money that's being requested. But it may be difficult for a project without completely redesigning their project and the structure that they're presenting to come back and be more competitive.
Megan and Rebecca, Nicole, sorry, congratulations on putting this together. I mean, for the short time I've been on the Housing Authority, I've always thought that a point system was necessary for transparency and objectivity and also to be able to leverage the process that applicants go through already, which is your project competitiveness, either going through SIDLAC. Now, this is going to be, when you're looking at this, the 2021 TCAC and SIDLAC application. Is that what we're going to be reviewing? And so just because an applicant is not going through that process, they can still fill out that application for those 10 points. Is that correct?
They can still fill out the application, and in our prior funding rounds, we still make them submit the application. It certainly may affect their competitiveness in our review because they're not seeking that funding source. But again, it depends on the applications that we receive. And there are other areas where they may excel compared to another application.
And Megan, one other piece of information. Megan, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the intent of this NOFA is to put forward projects and position projects who are applying for the upcoming TCAC and SIDLAC and MHP state programs. So for this specific NOFA, having the rating criteria from their self-scores would be appropriate, but that may be a category that is looked at future NOFAs to determine if we're going to keep it there, depending on the intent. This is the focus NOFA where we're specifically trying to position programs for those other funding sources.
I've gone through the scoring system for the SIDLAC and TCAC application, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of affordability, bedroom size, service and amenities, and to follow up with one of the commissioner's points about Commissioner Burke's point about if you have child care services on there, that would qualify under the services and amenities for 10 points. Is that correct? Following that category, Nicole or Megan?
Yes, and I made a note to make sure that we revise that in the draft NOFA language and in our point system to include on-site services and amenities. And one of the things we have highlighted in prior NOFAs and the application review is what are the services that are being provided to the tenants? Are there, after-school programs, counseling? So there's a wide variety of opportunities that some developers provide on-site, and so we'll make sure that that's included in that point category.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe those services that you just discussed would make them score higher on their SIDLAC and TCAC application.
I believe so.
Well, congratulations. This is really good. I think it moves forward. It provides a lot of clarity for, as Commissioner Olson stated, it helps staff and it helps applicants to have more clarity in terms of how their projects will be scored. Are there any other questions from commissioners? So Megan, before I open this up for public comment, what is the recommendation if this needs to go out in a NOFA in a week? What are you looking for direction from Housing Authority commissioners to be able to approve this structure and go forward? Because there's nothing to vote on.
Correct. There's no action. It's just direction. So what we're looking for is the housing authority supportive of this concept? And then as we discussed, we'll return for a debrief after we've given it this run with the 21-22 NOFA process and evaluate, was this successful? How can we improve it for future funding rounds? So again, just, is this something that you are in support of us proceeding with?
I'm hearing support unless one of the commissioners wants to, all the comments that I had have been supportive of this process.
I'd be interested in hearing from the public. Just, I mean, before, I suggest maybe we listen to the public and then kind of conclude.
Okay. So with that, I'll open it up for public comment.
We are now taking public comments on item 4.3, fiscal year 21-22, notice of funding availability process. Do you wish to make a comment via Zoom? Please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. A countdown timer will appear for the convenience of the speaker and the viewers. Please make sure the first speaker will be acknowledged and invited to speak. Please make sure to unmute yourself when you are invited to do so. Your microphone will be muted at the end of that countdown or at the conclusion of your comment. Our first speaker is Mary Stomp. Mary, I have given you speaking permission. Can you confirm that you see the timer?
I see the timer.
Okay, your time starts now.
Thank you. I'm Mary Stomp. I'm Executive Director of PEP Housing. First, I applaud you for coming up with a scoring system. It will allow you to be much more transparent. As a developer, I didn't think that the CDBG-DR process was transparent. I had asked for to review the scoring and there wasn't any. So I really applaud you in doing that. But I do want to talk to you about your criteria. Bedroom size will be a huge disadvantage to senior projects. And the state funding sources have moved away from giving bedroom size points. So I encourage you to remove that as a criteria. Last year was also a focus NOFA. So those of us that weren't seeking TCAC or HCD funds were unable to apply. So I encourage you to rethink about the disadvantage for you for saying if you're not seeking TCAC or HCD funds, like for example, our project where we were building 26 studios, I raised like $3.5 million. You should encourage that kind of funding because it takes less public funding for projects. So I don't agree with I think it's a real disadvantage for you to basically remove projects. They're not going to be competitive for those not seeking TCAC and HCD funds. And then finally, I encourage you to set aside some funds for rehabilitation. I think this is a really important area. And I think that there should be an opportunity with the funding to put some funds aside for rehabilitation. But I applaud you for setting up a point system, but I ask that you relook at your categories because it's a real disadvantage to senior projects, those projects that are trying to be more creative and raising funds from the community should not be penalized under this process, and to include rehab funding. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Efren Carrillo. Efren, I have enabled your speaking permission. Can you confirm that you can see the timer for me, please?
Confirmed.
Okay, your time starts now.
Good afternoon, Chair Owen, Housing Authority members, thank you for the opportunity to comment this afternoon. Efren Carrillo, Director of Housing with Burbank Housing. Please allow me just a quick moment to state the obvious that the housing staff of the city has been exemplary through the better part of the last few years, looking at prior NOFAs, and your interim director, Bessinger, has not missed one beat in tandem with your staff. And I do appreciate the Housing Authority members acknowledging that and seeing the amount of work that goes into putting these NOFAs together and working through the various complicated matters that come in the affordable housing development world. I also appreciate Housing Authority member Burke's comments around including some component of rehabilitation as far as also having new production and having that option for applications that come through. We do think that there will be oversubscription, as there generally is with funds available, but we do appreciate a scoring rubric or scoring matrix that at least gives you an opportunity to prioritize projects through that framework. So we are certainly supportive of that process and look forward to this feedback coming forward to the Housing Authority. So we're here to support your process and look forward to the release of the NOFA, and would agree with Board Member Burke and also with Executive Director Mary Stomp, we just heard from, that rehab funding should be incorporated for this NOFA. Thank you.
Thank you, Efren. Our next speaker is going to be Devin Neary. Devin, I've enabled your speaking permissions. Can you please confirm that you can see the countdown timer?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, thank you. Your time starts now.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Devin Neary, and I'm a project manager with the nonprofit affordable housing developer Mid-Penn Housing in our North Bay office. Thank you so much for the presentation today and your work on this. We're working to assemble, local financing needed to, like you said, apply for bonds and tax credits for 2 projects in Santa Rosa right now. And as you mentioned in the past, these local funding options haven't always been aligned with the competitive state funding programs, both timing and the scoring criteria. So to bring the Housing Authority funds, into alignment with these state programs, we definitely support the Commission adopting this objective point scoring criteria for the applications. As you stated, we agree this will ensure that the proposed projects are fitting within the Housing Authority's goals and will streamline the review and selection process. We also really support including high resource areas as one of the scoring criteria to align with the state funding programs. And other criteria we support include giving local preference to local developers and giving points to incentivize robust community engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devin. Our next speaker is going to be Yesenia Lemus. Yesenia, I've enabled your speaking permission. Can you please confirm that you can see the countdown timer?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, your time starts now.
First off, I just wanted to thank the commissioners for all the work that you do. My name is Yesenia Lemus, and I'm an associate project manager with nonprofit affordable housing developer Mid-Penn Housing, also in the North Bay office as Devin. As you know, affordable housing financing programs are very competitive in order to submit a competitive tax credit and bond application. Our projects need local soft financing. So we agree and thank the Santa Rosa Housing Authority to release the Housing Trust and CDBG NOFA next week, where it could align with the second round of competitive bond applications from CIDLAC that is due May 13th of this year. This would allow our project to be eligible to submit CIDLAC application and be competitive. Not only do we agree with the Housing Authority to release the NOFA next week, but we also recommend the Housing Authority to release their funding recommendations prior to the CIDLAC deadline. As earlier this year, the first round of bond applications, we were not able to submit our application
due to our project not being awarded the City of Santa Rosa CDBG DR local funds. If the Housing Authority can make recommendations prior to the FIDBLAC deadline, that would allow the developer to include the local funding in the financing strategies for the application and to be competitive. We think if these changes were implemented, it would help the Housing Authority with your housing goals and help the developer position our projects to move forward in a timely manner. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Yesenia. Chair Owen, at this time, I do not see any more hands raised, and we have not received any email public comment.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up with some of the questions here and comments. So one of the questions that came up from Mary Stomp was if a project is not going in for FIDLAC or TCAC, the application is, we look at these with the leveraging up to 10 points, or project competitiveness up to 10 points. If the applicant fills out the 2021 FIDLAC/TCAC MHP scoring, even though they're not going in through that round, but they fill out that application, which is available off the state's website, would that be able to be used in terms of that category?
Chairman Owen, I'm not sure how valuable that would be, because I think it would kind of take away the intent of seeing whether or not a project's actually competitive in that funding round. So if you're just taking a look at the scoring, even though they're not going to be an applicant, that may defeat the purpose of including that in our review process.
So if I look at that in some project scores, and I don't remember what the scoring criteria is, one scores 90 points and one scores 80 points. How would you take that difference into calculating the 10 points on that project competitiveness category?
I'm not sure I understood your question.
If a project in that filling out the application scored 90 points, compared to a project that scored 80, not taking into account whether or not that was enough to put them over receiving 9% tax credits or tax exempt bonds, how would that score in that 10-point category?
Nicole, if you can weigh in. So Nicole was key in developing this scale and identifying the category ranges. How we would take a look at it. Would it still be eligible for a couple points if it was not that competitive?
There's a couple ways that we could look at the scoring for the NOFAs. Again, it's my understanding that this NOFA is intended to position projects that are applying for those state funds, so they would have an application for SIDLAC or TCAC or MHP, in which they would have a self-scoring rubric. The smaller categories within their self-scoring 10-point category are written such that if your self-scores within, for example, like the top 10 or 20% of total available points, then you would score, for example, a 10. I'm just throwing these numbers out here. These are examples. So that if the self-scoring total numbers possible for each of the varying applications are different down the road, we're not seeing results that aren't consistent. One option would be for projects that are not eligible to apply for tax credits, for example, the smaller projects, to rate all of the projects as a percentage of total points. So for example, if there's a smaller project that is not applying for tax credits, their total number of points would be 90. Say they got a perfect score, they would get 90 out of 90, which is still 100%. And we would look at the percentages compared to other project applications. For example, if somebody was going for a tax credit and they received 97 points out of 100, they would be at a 97% compared to these smaller projects 100%. So that could be an option that we would look at. But again, none of these scoring options are going to be perfect and make everybody happy. So that may be something that we need to look to the Housing Authority for direction on what to do in that situation.
And in looking at, as Nicole was explaining that, and in looking at the categories we've laid out, if there was a specific interest of the Housing Authority to make sure that projects such as senior rental housing are competitive, we could make that special needs and senior set aside so that way it's competitive in that category versus just units that were set aside for formerly homeless individuals or another population.
I have a question.
Any of the commissioners have comment on that?
I have a question for Nicole. She had mentioned the term rubric, which is something I use all the time in teaching, so that if I'm ranking a homework assignment and somebody gets a 2, the person can go over and look at the rubric and figure out what criteria led them to get a 2, as opposed to just getting a 2 with no particular explanation. I'm wondering how detailed your rubric is, so an applicant would know why they got scored the way that they did.
So thank you for your question, Commissioner Downey. Each different category has a different number of points available to it. And in most cases, there are a set number of possible answers. So that would determine the point scale. For example, if project readiness, for example, if we're looking at if the project is entitled, does it have all of its building permits in hand? The possible answers are, yes, it's fully entitled pending payment of fees. It's in the process of obtaining the permits, or no permits have been applied for. So there's really only 3 options on how to answer that question. So in that situation, there would be 3 different categories within that 10-point scale. So they would, for example, either get a score between a 7 and a 10 for building permits that are ready to be picked up pending payment of fees, and so on down the list.
So they might not like the score, but they would certainly understand that, you know, their funding was not quite to the level that would get them a higher score, for an example.
Right, and our goal is to make the scoring method transparent and digestible to the applicants. But again, none of the scoring methods are going to make every project applicant happy every time.
Yes, there are always cranky people.
If I just may add a point through the chair. So it's great that, as you've mentioned, that staff has come up with this point scoring system, and it is just a recommendation to your board. And so there'll still be an opportunity for developers or folks who've submitted proposals to make their pitch and say why they disagree with the scoring or to look at it differently. So, you know, it's an initial step, and, you know, can be fine-tuned as it moves forward.
This is an initial, well, I think what we're talking about here, I appreciate your comments about the degree to which we can give any specific direction on this, because I think it's going to be an administrative decision given the time that we have. There's no time to do anything else. So whatever it is, it has to be up to Nicole and Megan to make a decision on that. But, you know, input, I guess, is maybe what can be considered. On the funding part, unless I'm missing something, if you have a $10 million hole to fill to fund a project, does it make any difference if it comes from tax credits or, you know, donations from some very wealthy entity?
In terms of the leveraging category that we're putting forward, no, it doesn't identify the funding source. It provides points based on the percentage of project funding that is from the Housing Authority.
Okay, so the source of the funds, yeah,
right.
so it's not a disadvantage on the source of the funds. And then I guess on the senior versus other type of housing, you know, it's been my experience that it's just more difficult to get family housing, and particularly for large families. It's just hard to do that. But I don't know to what degree that's changed. I don't, you know, thinking about what does Santa Rosa need? What do the residents of the city of Santa Rosa need right now? Is there a high priority for family housing? Is there a high priority for senior housing? And unless we know that, it's really hard to think about for the future or give any input right now on the degree to which a senior project should be advantaged or disadvantaged. I think it's based upon the community needs, and I don't know to what degree that can be determined quickly, but I think it's something that we need to pick up in the future and talk more about.
And that's certainly a factor that we could take a look at in the other factors category, and something that the Housing Authority, when recommendations are presented to them in the public meeting, we can take a look at past funding recommendations, because with the CDBG DR, the Housing Authority supported 5 projects, I believe, and 2 of those were specifically senior projects. So we can incorporate additional data, and then we can also look at what our recent actions have been and whether there's a balance.
Any other comments from commissioners?
We've made some really good progress. I mean, the staff has made a really good amount of progress, and it's a big step forward, and we're hearing that from the applicants. You know, always going to need to be refinements, and that's one thing that happens in government. You have to be as nimble as possible, and that's not always easy to do. So I think it's a process that you just can continue to monitor and adapt as best you can.
So Megan, on timing on this, you would put this out in a NOFA this coming week, next week?
If we would like to be able to review applications prior to the May 13th CIDLAC deadline, we need to push this out next week in order to give adequate time for applicants to prepare and submit their applications, and then for staff to review those applications and convene the review committee. Also, Chair Owen, if you would like to identify 2 commissioners to serve as the review committee, that would be helpful as well.
So point 1, what I'd like to do is provide direction, listening to commissioners, and also to call-ins, which were very helpful to have that input and have the feedback to make sure that what we're trying to do is functional, is going to work, with the understanding that this is the first time that I know of that the Housing Authority has done a point system, and it can always be tweaked, just as we've seen at the state level. The application for CIDLAC or TCAC has been a point system for close to 20 years, and it's constantly being tweaked to try and get better. So that is the mindset of the Housing Authority and staff, to be able to have this put in place. I'd like to recommend to go ahead with providing, putting the NOFA out next week with this criteria for the point system as presented, with the understanding that seniors projects would score high in the services and amenities and other factors category that the city is looking for. And to the point that for project competitiveness, that in the subcommittee that we will put together, we can review Nicole's very accurate and useful recommendation that if you are not presenting, my understanding, let me back up. When I was reading this, it's saying, even if you're not going to go into CIDLAC or TCAC or MHP, that application is there, and you would look at it and fill out that application, get your score off of it, present it and for here, even though you're not going to the state level to get those funding sources, that would allow you to get project competitive points, we can either look at that and I'll let staff figure out if they want to do it that way, or as Nicole recommended, there's 10 criteria. If you did not do that because you're not going in for that funding source, you would get 9 out of 9 or 90 out of 90 points. And I'll let the subcommittee work on that point. And I think the subcommittee that did the CDBGR did very well. Commissioner Olson, you had a point?
No, I would just like to be in that subcommittee if possible.
Any of the volunteers to be on the subcommittee? Come on, I'm going to appoint somebody.
How about you, Mr. Owen? Chair Owen.
I, in the past, have had to recuse myself in case there's a possibility of a client of mine having to step in, and I'd rather not put my name out there and then have an applicant come in that just happens to be a client, and I'd have to recuse myself. Vice Chair Test and Commissioner Burke, you were on the last one. Would either of you like to join Commissioner Olson?
I would defer to Vice Chair Test.
Certainly, I would welcome participation.
Oh, thank you. So I'd recommend that Commissioner Olson and Commissioner Test, Vice Chair Test, be on the subcommittee. And there's been discussion about whether or not we would have somebody with City Council on there. Megan, what do you think about that point?
I think it's a good point. I can certainly reach out to the mayor and see if he can appoint someone, if that's the direction of the Housing Authority.
I think that's a good opportunity, but if the idea is that if the mayor doesn't see that point, or well, I don't want it to slow us down. So I'd give a recommendation that we welcome that, to add one person from city council member. But if that doesn't seem to work out, Megan, would you like to give a timeline as to get feedback, to hear back?
Yeah, I will reach out to him later this evening and see, but then can also proceed with your direction that if we don't have someone who can participate on our timeline, we still proceed with our 2 Housing Authority commissioners.
What time limit would you give on that feedback as to when they're not?
Within a week.
Within a week it is.
And then if I can, if you would just indulge me, if I can just repeat back what I heard to make sure that we are capturing the Housing Authority's direction in the NOFA, that would be appreciated. I heard that you would like to have rehab included as an eligible activity.
Yes.
We are going to include on-site amenities and services in the services and amenities point category.
That's
We're
correct.
going to add seniors to the special needs category.
Yes.
Is there anything I am missing?
The only thing that is being brought up is whether or not project competitiveness for applicants that are not going to state, CIDLOC, TCAC, or MHP, as to whether or not they would be, that would be kicked out in terms of their score. Unless I'm wrong, I look at it, you can still fill out that application and get a scoring on that category, versus you don't have to turn it into the state. It just helps our process, and it provides continuity and consistency with the other applicants. That's how I would view that.
And it's certainly something that once the applications come in and we're reviewing and ranking them, we can isolate that particular category and run it by the review committee and see how that alters a project's competitiveness within our process.
I like that recommendation. I think that's a valid way to look at it, because we're not going to know until the applications actually come in. Nicole, do you have a comment on that?
I just wanted to throw out there that it may not change the ranking, the overall places that the applications come in. And it would not be any significant amount of work by staff to run the projects both ways and bring that to the subcommittee to see if it does change the scoring.
I think that's a valid way to look at it. Thank you. Any other comments from commissioners? Hearing none, thank you very much, Nicole. A lot of great work on this, and Megan as well. I think we're doing well in terms of something that started since I've been on the commission, which is to work with the applicants to make sure that as they're going into bigger and state funds, that they have their local match figured out or understood to help them. And the sooner we can work with those time schedules, the sooner we can get units built and continue to knock down the numbers that we need to have for affordable units in Santa Rosa. So, and again, with the transparency with this process and far more objectivity that can be seen, I think it's a good process. So thank you very much. With that, we'll go on to item number 5, which is public comments.
Mr. Chair, if I may interrupt, and I apologize to all the commissioners, but unfortunately I have a conflict and another matter that I was supposed to have attended starting at 4 o'clock. So Megan has the ability to reach out to me and I can jump back into the meeting if there are any issues. So I apologize for that, but I'm going to have to step out for now.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
We are now taking public comments on agenda item number 5, public comments on non-agenda items. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. A countdown timer will appear for the convenience of the speaker and viewers. The first speaker will be acknowledged and invited to speak. Please make sure to unmute yourself when you are invited to do so. Your microphone will be muted at the end of that countdown or at the conclusion of your comment. This is the time when any person may address the Housing Authority on matters not listed on this agenda, but which are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Housing Authority. Chair Owen, at this time, I do not see any hands raised and we have not received any email public comments.
Thank you. Move on to item 6, which is the approval of minutes. We don't need to take a vote on this, but I do want to see if there's any comments on the minutes from our last meeting. Are there any objections to those minutes?
Fine to me.
Thank you. So we'll, for the record, show there was unanimous consent to approve the minutes of our last meeting. Moving on to item 7, which is Chairman Commissioner reports. And there is a comment that we have, this is on item 7.1, which is the Housing Authority may provide the chair direction on whether to send a letter to the city manager requesting participation in executive director recruitment. There was, let me go back here just for a moment. So one of the things we want to talk about, I'd like to talk about for this item 7 is that the Housing Authority is, in fact, is a separate and district legal entity to the city of Santa Rosa. And it's has a long-standing formal contractual relationship directly with HUD for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And additional housing-related policy responsibilities have been delegated to the Housing Authority by the City Council, including allocations, TDBG funds for housing and home funds. And staffing for the Housing Authority, including the Executive Director of the Housing Authority, is provided by the City of Santa Rosa. And so we would like to have the Housing Authority respectfully request that that a Housing Commissioner selected by myself as the chair be invited and included in the appropriate panel that interviews candidates before making a recommendation to the city manager. So as we're going through the final application process and getting to an executive director, I do think it's very important that we have someone on the Housing Authority be part of that process to review, to make sure the direction is consistent with what the Housing Authority has had in the past, and make sure that there's also the legacy of information and policies and procedures and histories of the Housing Authority can continue going forward. And are there any volunteers that would like to be on in discussion with Human Resources of the city to review applicants?
Jeff, I'd like to volunteer.
Are there any other applicants?
I would be interested if the opportunity arises. I think it's up to you to appoint whomever, but certainly something that I support. I brought it up last time, and I said, can we can a letter just go forward? We wouldn't have Jeff here to, do we need any action by the full house?
Again, this item was intended to provide the chair with support for writing a letter. So not identifying individuals at this time, because you're simply requesting that the city manager and the city's human resources department include you in the process, or include a member in the process. So this is to get the entire body's support on drafting that letter.
So is Megan, as you pointed out, the step one would be to draft the letter, and in that process to see if we're even allowed to be a part of, which I think the Housing Authority should absolutely be a part of the process. Then at that point in time, once that allowance has been provided from the city manager, then we can appoint somebody to do that, to be part of that process.
And as was mentioned at last month's meeting, there are no current time constraints. The recruitment has not been open, so it's not like there's a deadline that we're bumping up against. So I think drafting the letter and getting that out within the next week or so would certainly be a good first step.
And I think the main point, from the city's standpoint, I think thinking that this might be a slippery slope in terms of the other boards and commissions, I think that's not a concern, because the Housing Authority is very unique in regards to being a separate legal entity and having an executive director that's called out in, I believe, state law, and I think maybe even in the federal contracts that we have with HUD, as an executive director is called out. So there's a different relationship, I think, between the Housing Authority and the staff, particularly the executive director in our case. So having some input, we're not asking to make the decision, we're asking to have input into the decision.
And I think that, and Commissioner Burke, to follow with that, is if you look at the funding sources, the revenue sources, the budget for each department, and Megan, this figure, and actually if you could email it to me, that'd be helpful. The overall revenue budget for last year, we don't need to look at the budget number that went through the Housing Authority, and how much of that was actually coming from the federal level. And also, well, in CDBG-DR, we would not count that, because that would be this fiscal year, the last fiscal year, and that actually came from the federal level through the state, but it was still federal money, and I would count that as, and so that way, the point that Commissioner Burke is making is that the percentage of revenue that goes through this department is not coming from city budget numbers, and that's an important distinction. So hearing that, I will work on such a letter and get it sent out to the city manager's office. Moving on to, this is not, I don't see this requires any, 7.1 requires public comment. So item 8 for committee reports. Are there any committee reports? I don't think we don't have any subcommittees at this point. So item 8, we'll move on to item 9, which is the executive director report. And Megan, I will let you take that on.
Yes, first, if I could just give a brief update on the commissioner application process. So applications have been received by the city and reviewed. They are with the city clerk, who will be scheduling interviews. The interview process, I think, is going to be occurring in early May. It was tentatively scheduled in April, but due to scheduling conflicts with the city council, I think it is in May. And the city clerk will be providing me with updates as that scheduling evolves. So hopefully we'll have at least 2 tenant commissioners in the near future to assist the Housing Authority, and then we will learn more about reappointments and applications. And then the next item is a communication item. It is the pending development pipeline. This was prepared following the review of the CDBG DR applications. And this is just to give you an update on where projects currently are at within the Housing Authority's funding process. So there's no presentation associated with this unless there are questions.
Any questions?
I have a question if you have. Thanks for this. It's really nice having that information. And I don't know if you can squeeze it in, but if you can squeeze it in, it would be helpful to me, I know, to have the address of those complexes. I know you have the general part of the community, but most of them I'm familiar with, but it's always nice to be able to make sure that in my rounds, I take a look and see how things are proceeding on these projects. And then the other item, which is kind of in the case of Dutton Flats, I think the article in the paper had indicated that that original developer that submitted a proposal had sold the project to another developer. Is that correct?
I can probably answer that.
Please.
So the developer is Phoenix Development. They used to be in Minneapolis. They've been in the Santa Rosa, Sonoma County area 8 to 10 years. And then they work with a nonprofit developer, Integrity Housing, out of Orange County. So it was, to the extent that it was under option under Phoenix and then work together to get it to the, which is quite common. You'll see a project being tied up with an option to purchase, and then once everything is put together, is put into the entity for development. I think that might be what you're looking at, but the newspaper article did have something that was confusing about being from Minneapolis, but he started there. He's been out here for a long time.
But is that the same group that originally came through and got funding approval through the Housing Authority?
Megan?
Sorry, too many windows open. I was looking at our documents right now to see what entity we originally lent to and if there was any changes on file. So I'll have to get back to you on that because I'm not able to call that information up quickly.
I mean, the reason that I bring it up is because I don't know there's anything that can be done about it, but you go through the process of vetting a particular group, and then maybe you're dealing with an entirely different group for the balance of the construction and the management and the maintenance over the years.
Our regulatory agreement does speak to the ownership of the project, and if there is a wholesale change in ownership, that does need to be reviewed and approved by staff, and then we provide either an administrative approval or denial of such action. We have not done that for Dutton Flats, so I'll need to take a look at whether it was a limited partnership that we originally lent to and who the parties of that partnership were.
Great. I'm glad that we have that in place, and I'm glad that we'll find out what the status is and make sure that it's done properly.
Commissioner Burtmite, for clarification on that, if an entity comes through and gets pre-development funding and then gets tax credit funding wherein they have to sell 99% of the project to their tax credit partner, that technically would show that they no longer have majority ownership in that entity, but they are still the developer, but just due to the tax credit structure, they would not have controlling interest. I just want to be careful that I understand what you're saying, that you want to make sure it's the same people running the development. But if we tie it to ownership structure, especially for these deals that get tax credits, they're not going to have majority ownership because the tax credit partner would get 99% of that project.
All right, and I was able to, in that time period, able to look up the authorizing resolution that was approved by the Housing Authority in June 2019, and we lent to Dutton Flats LP. So we would need to do a little bit more research on who is currently owning the project and if it is in fact the limited partnership. That should be something that the developer communicates to us before there's any transaction.
Well, thank you.
Megan, on this list, Lantana, is that for sale or for rent, 48 units?
Lantana is a 48 unit ownership project. It initially started in 2007, so I'm very excited to see this nearing completion as a rental project. And Burbank Housing, as of earlier this morning, is anticipating the units being completed this summer, so summer 2021. And that'll be 48 ownership units.
Is that something, again, we're going to probably squeeze this down where the print is too small, but if you could put down if it's ownership or rental.
That would be a great addition. Yes, we can do that. And it's certainly something we want to highlight are the ownership units that we are creating.
I guess if we're doing that, the type, is it for seniors or for other family households? I know some of these are pretty easily identifiable, but others aren't, I think.
We may need to make it a legal size document. But we can certainly incorporate changes to help provide more information.
Or provide more information in the cells just going vertically.
And certainly our goal is to also provide more regular updates of this. So we will update it again after we review the Focus NOFA applications.
So this does include the CDBGR?
Nicole is nodding. Yes.
Okay, sorry. I was looking at my other screen where I'm looking at the list versus the camera screen. Any other questions from commissioners?
All right.
Okay, moving on to consent items. Oh.
Chair Owen, I believe.
We need to go to public comment on this item. So open up for public comment.
We are now taking public comment on item number 9.1, pending development pipeline update. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you're dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. The countdown timer will appear for the convenience of the speaker and the viewers. The first speaker will be acknowledged and invited to speak. Please make sure to unmute yourself when you are invited to do so. Your microphone will be muted at the end of that countdown or at the conclusion of your comment. Chair Owen, at this time I see no hands raised and we have not received any email public comment.
Thank you. We'll move on to item 10, which is the consent item for the resolution of rescission of housing authority. And I'll transfer to Megan to discuss this consent item.
All right, so item 10.1, which is a consent item, is a resolution, rescission of Housing Authority Resolution number 1692, which had approved a conditional commitment of loan funds in the amount of $4.2 million and an allocation of 134 Article 34 units. And Housing Authority Resolution 1693, which had approved an allocation of 8 project-based vouchers for the Turk Winery Village project at 8 West 9th Street and 808 Donahue Street. This is a consent item, so unless there are specific questions from the Housing Authority, there is no presentation. but Nicole Rothbun, Program Specialist, is available to field any questions.
Any questions from the commissioners?
Certainly makes sense to me. It brings up on the previous chart that we just looked at, it has the Deterk Winery Village still listed. So would that come off? Yeah, thank you.
And as we go through the NOFA process, this $4.2 million now goes into the NOFA for this year. Is that correct, Megan?
That is correct. And it's this $4.2 million that allows us to have an estimate of over $8 million in the next round.
So I'm looking at the consent items here.
So Chair Owen, if there aren't any questions, if you could ask for a motion in a second.
There we go. Okay, so I'm asking for a motion on this consent item.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent, to approve the consent item.
Is there a second?
I'll make a second.
So we need to have the clerk do a roll call vote, please.
Okay, let's go ahead and do a roll call vote. We'll start with Commissioner Burke.
Aye.
And then Commissioner Downey.
Aye.
Commissioner Olson.
Aye.
Vice Chair Test.
Aye.
And Chair Owen.
Aye.
Okay. That motion passes unanimously with all ayes, and yeah, that passes unanimously.
Thank you. We'll move on to item number 11, which is report items, and we don't have any. So we now move to item 12, which is the public hearing. And Megan and I will let you read the title and introduce the staff presenter.
Item 12.1 is a public hearing, adoption of public housing agency plans. Rebecca Lane, Housing and Community Services Manager, presenting.
Thank you, Megan. And good evening, commissioners. The item before you is an item to approve the public housing agency plans for fiscal year 2021 through 2022 and a 5-year plan for fiscal year 2021 through 2026. Next slide, please. The purpose of the public housing agency plans is to outline resources, strategies, and other policies that we set out to meet the Housing Choice Voucher program goals. We also provide annual updates through this process on the Housing Authority activities. The PHA plans are reviewed by a resident advisory board and by the public, as well as being reviewed and approved by the Board of Commissioners, and then they're ultimately submitted to HUD. Previously, the resident advisory board has been established as the sitting members of the Housing Authority Board of Commissioners, who are tenant commissioners. But in the absence of the appointed tenant commissioners, at this meeting, we have established a separate resident advisory board this year, which consisted of former tenant commissioners Fran Bolduc and Leora Johnson-Morgan. The resident advisory board reviewed and discussed the both the 5-year and the annual PHA plans, and those comments are attached to the plan. And any additional comments that we received tonight from the public or from the commissioners will also be included in the plan document that is ultimately submitted to HUD. And next slide, please. So the first document that I will go over is the annual plan for 2021 through 2022. So you may recall that the last time we brought this annual plan was just about a year ago. It was just before the beginning of the pandemic. And so to a large extent, our activities this year have been responding to the emergency. We implemented policies that allowed us to very quickly respond to requests for adjustment rental calculations for those families on the program who lost their income as a result of the pandemic. We also implemented waivers that were authorized by HUD, programmatic waivers in order to protect the health and safety of our participants and our staff. So that includes alternate inspection requirements and also our the way that we've been conducting our annual re-exams and interim re-examinations and other activities of the program. So we have been fully operational this entire time, the Housing Choice Voucher program. We've just been doing it in different ways to make sure that we maintain the safety of our participants. So one of the items that we had brought before you last year was that we are planning to convert to an electronic Housing Choice Voucher program waiting list. So that is still an activity that we're going to be pursuing and working forward on this coming year. We also will be, as this year comes up, we'll be working on a community outreach plan through the Community Engagement Office here with the City of Santa Rosa, as well as all of our existing nonprofit partners that we have always worked with in terms of our previous waiting list openings. We also will be continuing on in the annual plan our ongoing project-based voucher activity. And just in terms of a progress report that really touches on both the 5-year and the annual plan, I can report that we currently have 139 units, project-based voucher units that are active and under a HAP contract. And that amount, the number of units there, the 139 units, that is leveraging 322 total units in those projects. We also have 90 units that are under an agreement to enter into a housing assistance payments contract. And those 90 units are leveraging 216 total units. And then we have 140 project-based voucher units that are in the pre-commitment phase. And those units are leveraging an additional 616 affordable housing units here in the City of Santa Rosa. We will also continue, we've touched on this briefly in my previous presentation, but we will be continuing forward with the education and engagement around the source of income discrimination ordinances, which passed last year on both the state and local level. So those became law in 2020, and we will continue our efforts to educate the landlord community about that, as well as the tenant community, and make sure that tenants understand their rights under that program and that the landlords understand the requirements of those ordinances. Next slide, please. So the 5-year plan, those of you who have been with us on the Board of Commissioners for a few years may recall that this seems a little early, and it's true. We are reviewing and resubmitting the 5-year plan that we submitted in for fiscal year 2019 through 2024. And the reason for that is that the regional field office for the Department of Housing and Urban Development requested that we realign the time frame on our plan to have some regional continuity to allow the field office to review the plans at the same time. So there are not many significant changes between the plan that we submitted in 2019. In addition to the progress that we've made in the project-based vouchers, we also, I can report for this plan, we did fully utilize all of the limited preference vouchers that we had set aside, and to remind commissioners what that effort is we set aside 48 vouchers for referrals that were coming through the Disaster Recovery Center, the Long-Term Disaster Recovery Center known as the ROC. And we also set aside 24 vouchers for people experiencing homelessness, and those referrals were coming through the coordinated entry system. So all of those vouchers have been utilized. In addition, going forward in the 5-year plan, we will continue to apply for new vouchers as they become available. And within the next 5 years, we anticipate that some of those might be VASH vouchers, additional VASH vouchers. We currently have 414 VASH vouchers, and we anticipate that more may be coming to our agency. Our housing authority has performed very well in the VASH program, and so that tends to make us eligible for additional allocations. We also anticipate that we will be applying for and receiving vouchers under a new HUD initiative called the Foster Youth Initiative. And so this is similar to VASH insofar as that our partner agency is the local human services agency. And these are vouchers that are made available to foster youth who are referred to the housing authority for assistance. And we, in turn, when we receive a referral from the foster care agency, we will request a voucher specific to that foster youth who's aging out of foster care. We'll request that voucher on behalf of that foster youth directly from HUD. And so this will be a program that operates a little differently than we have ever had vouchers before, where we apply for them on a case-by-case basis. But we are actively working with our local partner agencies on that process. We also are aware that the recent rescue plan that was passed recently, the congressional level and signed into law, we're aware that there are some resources for vouchers in that package. We just don't know yet what that might look like for our agency or any housing authority. But we have heard that there are possibly time limited or other disaster type vouchers that are in that legislation, and we would certainly be looking to apply to expand our program if those become available to our jurisdiction. We also will continue to integrate technology in our processes to further improve the efficiency and accessibility of our program for participants and owners. And this certainly was something that was on our radar prior to the pandemic and then became pretty essential in the last year as we've moved to remote interaction with our clients and with our landlords. So it was actually a bit of an opportunity to invest in some of this technology using the CARES Act funds that were made available to the Housing Authority because of the needs during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So our recommendation is that the Housing Authority adopt both the annual Public Housing Agency Plan for fiscal year 2021 through 2022 and the 5-year plan for fiscal years 2021 through 2026. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Are there any questions from commissioners?
Yeah, I have a question for Rebecca. Hi.
Commissioner Downey?
I know that there was a big transition from an old waiting list to a new waiting list, and now you're proposing to go to an electronic waiting list. Do you know about approximately how many people are on the waiting list for Section 8 housing?
Well, if I misspoke, I apologize. We're not making a new waiting list. We're just converting the waiting list that we have now to an electronic format so that we can more easily reach people, that we have the data better consolidated. So there will not be no waiting list will be discarded or anything like that. We're just going to make a conversion of the existing waiting list. And we have approximately 3,000 families on that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Just a question, Chair. The technology that you mentioned, Rebecca, does that include devices that can be used when the inspections are required for the voucher units?
Yes, so all of the staff are at this point equipped with devices, both phones and laptops. The virtual inspections require a device to be, the device belongs to the property owner in that setup. So we have not, for a variety of reasons related to HUD requirements that make the virtual inspections not the best choice for us in this agency, in this area. We haven't gone in that direction yet. But if there's more flexibility around that's introduced around the virtual inspections, then we might consider that. But again, that does require the owner or the property manager or property representative to be the one who serves as a proxy and has a device that can connect back to the housing authority. So that could be an iPhone or any other kind of smartphone.
Setting aside the conditions in the pandemic, I know there are programs that can be purchased to do an inspection using iPads, I think, for the most part. Is that something that we have?
Yes, we actually have currently several devices, iPads, that were issued to us from HUD when we became a pilot agency for the new inspection protocol called UPCSV, Uniform Physical Codes Standards for Voucher. HUD has since backed away from the UPCSV procedure and is piloting a new inspection requirement. So we're still using HQS. For a while, we were using both HQS and UPCSV, but we've stopped doing that since HUD has let that pilot go. So we do have iPad devices that we can use for inspections, and we have our own. We developed as part of the UPCSV process. We developed our own sort of interaction with our internal software from that iPad, where our inspectors be out in the field using an iPad rather than being on paper. So we're there already on that.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry for getting into the weeds on the process, but it's interesting that that you're doing that. Also, the voucher program is the heart and soul of the housing authority. So thank you.
Any other questions from commissioners? So hearing none, I'm going to open up for public comment.
We are now taking public comment on item number 12.1, public hearing, adoption of public housing agency plans. If you wish to make a comment via Zoom, please raise your hand. If you are dialing in via telephone, please dial *9 to raise your hand. You will have 3 minutes to make your comment. A countdown timer will appear for the convenience of the speaker and viewers. The first speaker will be acknowledged and invited to speak. Please make sure to unmute yourself when you are invited to do so. Your microphone will be muted at the end of that countdown or at the conclusion of your comment. Chair Owen, at this time, I do not see any hands raised, and we have not received any email public comments.
Thank you. Not hearing any other comments from commissioners and going through public comment. Looking for a motion to approve the resolution.
I'd be happy to make a motion, resolution of the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Rosa approving and adopting the Public Housing Agency Annual Plan for fiscal year 2021 through 2022 and 5-year plan for fiscal years 2021 through 2026 and waive the reading of the text.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll make a second to that.
Thank you, Vice Chair Test. The clerk can go ahead and
Okay, we'll go ahead and do a roll call vote. We'll start with Commissioner Olson.
Aye.
And then Commissioner Downey.
Aye.
Commissioner Burke.
Aye.
Vice Chair Test.
Aye.
And Chair Owen.
Aye.
Okay, that motion passes with 5 ayes unanimously.
And,
Thank
and
you
thanks,
very much.
and thanks to our former tenant commissioners for volunteering to serve and provide input. Very, very good input, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you. I will let them.
Chairman.
Thank you, everyone. We covered a lot of material today. Appreciate everybody's time and effort. And Megan, you and your staff did an excellent job as always. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Yay.
Long one, thank you.